You are standing on a sidewalk in a city that is both busy and not busy at all. The street is narrow, and the buildings on either side rise up 3 or 4 or 5 stories, their faces made of dark red brick that has been smoothed and stained by decades of weather and coal smoke. If you look closely at the brick, you will see that it is not truly red anymore, but a muted brownish color, with patches of soot that cling to the mortar lines like fine dark dust. The building in front of you is one of these structures, a tenement house built sometime in the middle of the 19th century, and it looks very much like all the others on this block, with only small differences in the height of the stoop or the design of the cast iron railings to set it apart. The sidewalk beneath your feet is made of large stone slabs that have worn down in the center, where countless feet have walked over the years. The surface is not smooth but slightly pitted and uneven, and in the cracks between the stones there is a fine accumulation of grey dirt and small pebbles that never quite get swept away. If you stand very still and look down, you can see that the stone is a light grey color with flecks of darker mineral scattered through it, and the edge where it meets the brick of the building is marked by a line of darker dampness that rises up a few inches from the ground. This is because the street is slightly lower than the foundation, and moisture travels upward through the old masonry in a slow and continuous way that no one ever thinks about. The building itself has a front door that is set back a few feet from the sidewalk and raised up by a short stoop of brownstone steps. There are 4 steps in total, and each one has a shallow dip worn into its center where shoes have pressed down over many years of coming and going. The first step is the most worn, and its front edge is rounded and soft-looking, not sharp like it would have been when the stone was first cut. The railing on either side of the stoop is made of cast iron painted black many years ago, and now showing patches of rust that are the color of dried autumn leaves. The iron is shaped into a simple pattern of vertical bars with a curved handrail on top that feels cool and slightly rough to the touch if you were to rest your hand there. The paint has bubbled in a few places where moisture got underneath, and small flakes of it have fallen away to reveal the dark metal beneath. Above the doorway there is a rectangular transom window made of 4 small panes of glass held together by thin wooden muntins. The glass is old and has a slight wavy quality to it, so that if you look through it, the shapes on the other side appear just a little distorted and softened. The glass is not perfectly clean, and there is a thin film of city grime on the outside that catches the light in a particular way, making the window appear more grey than clear. The wooden frame around the transom is painted the same dark brown as the door itself, and the paint is crackled into a fine network of lines like the surface of a dried mud puddle. The front door is made of heavy wood with 2 vertical panels recessed into its face. The wood grain is visible through the many layers of paint, and it runs in long wavy lines that curve around the knots in the timber. There is a brass doorknob that has lost its shine and now glows with a dull brownish warmth, and below it a keyhole with a brass escutcheon plate that is tarnished to a deep chocolate color. If you were to push the door open, you would feel its weight as it swings on iron hinges that have settled over time so that the door does not hang perfectly straight, but tilts inward just a fraction of an inch at the top corner. The sound it makes when it opens is a low creak that comes from the hinges themselves, and also from the wood rubbing against the frame at one particular spot near the bottom where the door has swollen slightly in the damp air. Stepping inside means leaving the grey light of the street behind and entering a long narrow hallway that stretches straight back into the building. The first thing you notice is the change in the quality of the light, because it is much dimmer here, and the air itself seems to hold a kind of brownish shadow that softens all the edges of things. The hallway is perhaps 3 feet wide, and the walls on either side are covered with plaster that has been painted a color that was once off-white, but has now faded to a pale yellowish cream with darker patches near the ceiling where dust and smoke have settled over time. The plaster is not perfectly smooth, but has a texture to it that comes from the horsehair mixed into the original coat and the many layers of calcimine that have been brushed on over the decades. In some places, you can see small hairline cracks that wander across the surface like the veins of a leaf, and in other places there are slightly raised areas where the plaster has separated just a little from the lath behind it. The floor of the hallway is made of long, narrow boards of pine that run the length of the space from the front door all the way to the back wall. These boards were once a light honey color, but they have been darkened by age and foot traffic and repeated applications of oil and wax until they are now a deep amber brown with blackened grain lines that stand out clearly. Each board is about 3 inches wide, and they are laid side by side with narrow gaps between them that have collected fine dust and small bits of debris over the years. When you step on the boards, they make a particular sound, depending on where you place your weight, and some of them have a slight springiness to them, while others are firm and solid, with only a quiet creak to mark your passage. The ceiling of the hallway is high, perhaps 9 or 10 feet above the floor, and it is made of the same plaster as the walls, though it has a slightly different texture because it was applied with a different sweep of the trowel. In the center of the ceiling there is a small opening where a gas pipe once protruded for a light fixture, and now there is only a round brass plate covering the hole with a small chain dangling from it that no longer connects to anything. The walls are broken at intervals by doorways leading to the ground floor apartments, and each doorway is framed by simple wooden casings that have been painted so many times that the corners are now softly rounded and the details of the molding are blurred and indistinct. The doors themselves are closed, and they are made of the same dark wood as the front door, with simple panels and small brass knobs that are dull with age. If you walk slowly down this hallway, you will notice that the light changes as you move farther from the front door, because the only source of illumination comes from that doorway behind you and from a small window at the very back of the hall that looks out onto a narrow yard. The middle section of the hallway is the darkest part, and here the walls seem to close in just slightly, and the air feels cooler and a little damp against your skin. There is a particular smell in this hallway that is made up of many different things, all blended together into a single quiet presence. You can detect the faint mustiness of old plaster and wood, the lingering trace of coal smoke that has seeped into every porous surface, the distant suggestion of cooking odors that drift down from the floors above, and underneath it all, the cool, earthy smell of the foundation stones that sit on the damp ground. This smell is not unpleasant, but simply old and settled, like the building itself. At the far end of the hallway, there is a staircase that leads up to the higher floors. The staircase is enclosed on both sides by walls, and it turns back on itself at a small landing so that it rises in a tight rectangular well. The stairs themselves are made of the same pine wood as the hallway floor, and they have been worn down in the center of each tread so that the wood is slightly scooped out and smooth to the touch. The front edge of each step is rounded, and the grain of the wood runs parallel to the length of the tread, creating long lines that guide the eye upward. There is a simple wooden handrail attached to the wall with metal brackets that are painted the same dark brown as everything else, and the handrail itself is worn to a silky smoothness from the countless hands that have slid along it over the years. The paint on the handrail is thinner in the middle section, where the most contact happens, and you can see the pale wood showing through in a long, continuous stripe. The stairwell walls are covered with wallpaper that has been there for a very long time. The pattern is difficult to make out in the dim light, but it seems to be a repeating design of small flowers or leaves on a background that was once cream-colored and is now a soft yellowish brown. The paper is peeled away in a few places near the ceiling where moisture has loosened the paste, and the edges curl inward, revealing the bare plaster beneath. In other spots, the paper is stained with darker patches that spread outward like the rings of a tree trunk, and these stains have a slightly shiny quality to them because they have absorbed oil and dirt from the air over many seasons. As you begin to climb the stairs, you notice how each step makes its own particular sound. The first step is quiet and solid, while the third step has a small squeak that comes from the left side near the wall, and the fifth step makes a low groaning sound as the wood flexes under your weight. These sounds are not loud or startling, but simply part of the building's voice, a quiet conversation between the wood and the weight it carries. The staircase turns at a small landing where there is a single window that looks out onto the narrow air shaft between this building and the one next door. The window has 6 small panes of glass that are covered with a fine layer of dust on the inside and sooty grime on the outside, and through them you can see the dark brick wall of the neighboring building just a few feet away. The light that comes through this window is grey and indirect, and it falls on the landing floor in a soft rectangle that shifts slowly as the sun moves across the sky outside. The second flight of stairs is much like the first, though the wear patterns are slightly different because fewer feet travel this high. The wallpaper continues up the wall, and the pattern becomes a little clearer here, where there is more light from the landing window. You can see now that the design is a repeating motif of small brown flowers with tiny green leaves on a field of pale cream, and the flowers arranged in vertical rows that march upward in a regular pattern. The paper is faded, and the colors have softened over time so that the brown is more of a sepia tone, and the green is barely visible as a faint grayish hue. At the top of the second flight there is another hallway that runs the length of the building, and this one is narrower than the ground floor, and it has doors on both sides leading to the apartments on this floor. The floorboards here are the same pine wood, and they creak in a different pattern than the stairs because the joists beneath them are spaced slightly differently, and the wear is concentrated in the center of the hallway rather than along the edges. The ceiling is lower here too, perhaps 8 feet high, and there are small patches where the plaster has been repaired with a slightly different shade of white, so that you can see the outline of the patch if you look carefully. At the far end of this hallway, there is a window that looks out onto the street, and through it you can see the building across the way, with its own row of windows and fire escapes. The glass in this window is old and wavy, and it makes the view outside seem slightly underwater, with the straight lines of the opposite building bending just a little at the edges. The light that comes through this window is the same grey light that fills the street below, and it travels down the hallway in a long narrowing shaft that illuminates the dust motes floating in the still air. Everything in this building is quiet now, as you stand in the hallway and listen. There is a low hum that comes from the city outside, and it seeps through the brick walls as a constant background presence that you stop noticing after a while. There are small sounds too that come from the building itself, such as the slight ticking of the wood as it adjusts to the temperature, and the faint whisper of air moving through the cracks around the window frames. If you stand very still and pay close attention, you might hear the distant sound of water running through a pipe somewhere in the walls, a low gurgling that rises and falls, and then stops altogether, leaving only the hum of the city and the quiet breathing of the old house around you. The walls of this hallway have a particular texture when you look at them closely. The plaster has been painted many times, and the layers of paint have built up in the corners and along the edges of the door frames, so that the sharp angles are now slightly softened and rounded. There are small bumps and irregularities in the surface from the original application of the plaster and from the subsequent layers of paint that have flowed and dried in uneven ways. In some places you can see the faint outline of the lath beneath the plaster as a series of parallel lines that are just barely visible through the many coats of paint. These lines run horizontally around the walls, and they create a subtle pattern that you only notice if you look for it. The doors along the hallway are all closed, and they are identical to one another in their basic form, though each one has its own particular details of wear and aging. One door has a small dent near the bottom, where something heavy was pushed against it long ago, and the paint is cracked in a star pattern around the impact point. Another door has a brass number plate that is tarnished and slightly crooked with small screws that have been painted over many times so that the slots are filled with dried paint. The doorknobs are all the same simple brass design, and they have been polished by countless hands until they glow with a soft, warm light that seems to come from within the metal itself rather than from any external source. The air in the hallway is still and cool, and it carries that same complex smell that you notice downstairs, though here it is slightly different because you are farther from the street and closer to the living spaces above. There is a faint trace of soap and the smell of clean laundry that has dried indoors, and a hint of something cooking far away that you cannot quite identify. These smells are not strong or distinct, but rather they are woven together into a single quiet presence that is part of the building's character as much as the worn floorboards and the faded wallpaper. If you were to open one of these doors and step inside, you would find a small apartment with its own particular arrangement of rooms and light and sound. But for now you remain in the hallway where everything is still and quiet. The building holds its breath around you, and the long afternoon light continues to fall through the window at the end of the hall, creating a soft rectangle on the floorboards that moves so slowly you cannot see it change. The dust motes drift in this beam of light, and they rise and fall on invisible currents of air that move through the building in ways that no one fully understands. This is the shape of the building, and this is how it feels to stand inside it on an ordinary afternoon in the middle of the 19th century. There is nothing remarkable happening here, and no story to follow, only the quiet presence of old walls and worn floors, and the slow passage of time measured by the creak of a floorboard and the shifting of the light across the plaster ceiling. The room is small and it is empty, and has been this way for some time. You enter through a door that swings inward on iron hinges that make a soft low sound like a breath being released. The door fits loosely in its frame and there is a gap at the bottom where a thin slice of light from the hallway slips through even when the door is fully closed. This gap is about the width of a finger and it runs the entire length of the threshold, and through it you can see the dark line of the hallway floorboards and the faint shadow of the opposite wall. The door itself is made of 2 vertical panels of pine that had been painted many times in a color that was once a pale cream and is now a yellowish brown with darker streaks where the grain of the wood has absorbed the paint differently over the years. The room measures roughly 10 feet in one direction and 12 feet in the other, though the walls are not perfectly square and the corners are not precisely 90 degrees. The floor slants slightly toward the window side of the room, a drop of perhaps half an inch over the full span, and this means that a marble placed on the bare boards would roll slowly and steadily toward the far wall. You cannot see this slant with your eyes, but you can feel it in your ankles when you stand in the center of the space as your body makes small unconscious adjustments to keep you upright. The ceiling above you is about 8 feet high, though it varies by a small amount from one corner to another because the joists overhead have settled at slightly different rates over the decades. The walls are plastered and painted with a thin coat of calcimine that has a faint bluish-white color like the underside of a cloud on an overcast day. The plaster surface has a particular texture that comes from the way it was applied with a wooden float, leaving behind subtle swirls and ridges that catch the light at certain angles. In the corner near the door, there is a small patch where the plaster has cracked in a fine web of lines that spread outward from a central point, where a nail was once driven into the wall to hold a picture or a small mirror. The nail is gone now, and only a tiny dark hole remains with a faint ring of rust around its edge, where the metal oxidized against the alkaline plaster. The single window is located in the wall opposite the door, and it looks out onto a narrow air shaft that separates this building from the one next door. The window opening is about 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, and it is divided into 2 sashes, each containing 6 small panes of glass held in place by thin wooden muntins that are painted a dark brown on the inside and a faded grey on the outside. The glass is old and imperfect, with small bubbles trapped inside it and subtle waves that distort the view of the brick wall just a few feet away. Some of the panes have a faint purple or greenish cast when the light hits them at a certain angle, and this comes from the impurities in the sand that was used to make the glass many years ago. The light that enters through this window is indirect and grey because the air shaft is narrow and the sky above is only a small rectangle of brightness that never reaches the bottom of the shaft. The brick wall opposite is so close that if you were to open the window and reach out your arm, you could nearly touch it with your fingertips. The bricks on that wall are dark red with blackened mortar, and they are arranged in a common bond pattern with every 6th row consisting of headers turned sideways to tie the inner and outer layers of the wall together. The surface of the bricks is rough and pitted, and there are small patches of greenish-grey moss growing in the crevices where moisture collects and never fully dries. The windowsill on the inside is a single piece of pine about 6 inches deep, and it has been painted white many times so that the paint is built up in the corners where the sill meets the side casings, creating small rounded fillets of accumulated layers. The surface of the sill is slightly tacky in humid weather, and there are faint water stains near the center where condensation has dripped down from the glass during cold nights. These stains are pale brown rings that overlap one another like the growth rings of a tree, and they have sunk into the wood beneath the paint so that even if you were to repaint the sill, they would eventually bleed through again. The floor of the room is made of the same narrow pine boards that run through the hallway outside, and they have been laid perpendicular to the door wall so that they stretch from left to right across the narrow dimension of the room. The boards are about 3 inches wide, and they vary slightly in width because they were cut by hand and planed individually with small variations that are only noticeable if you look closely. The grain of the wood runs in long wavy lines that are darker than the surrounding wood, and these lines create a kind of map across the floor with knots that look like small dark islands and straight sections that resemble rivers flowing toward the far wall. The boards have shrunk over time, and there are narrow gaps between them that range from the thickness of a piece of paper to nearly 1/4 of an inch in the widest spots. These gaps have collected fine dust and small bits of debris that have settled into the crevices over many years, so that when you look down you see dark lines running between each board like the lines of a drawing. The floor is bare and unvarnished, though it has a soft sheen in the areas where countless feet have walked, polishing the wood to a smooth, warm glow. The path from the door to the window is the most worn, and here the boards are slightly cupped with the edges raised just a fraction higher than the centers, so that your foot feels a gentle curve when you step on them. In the center of the ceiling there is a small round opening that was once fitted with a gas pipe for a light fixture, and now it is covered by a brass plate that is about 4 inches in diameter. The plate is held in place by 2 small screws that have been painted over so many times that the slots are completely filled with dried paint, and the brass itself is tarnished to a deep brownish gold that has a faint greenish tinge around the edges where the metal has reacted with the plaster. A short length of chain hangs from a small hole in the center of the plate, and it dangles down about 6 inches, ending in a small brass ring that catches the light from the window and glows softly in the dim room. The sounds in this room are subtle and layered, and they come from many different sources, both inside and outside the building. The most constant sound is the low hum of the city that seeps through the brick walls as a deep, steady vibration that you feel as much as you hear. This hum is made up of the distant rumble of wagons on cobblestones, and the faint clatter of horseshoes, and the occasional call of a street vendor that is so far away the words are lost, and only the rise and fall of the voice remains. These sounds are filtered through the brick and the plaster and the glass so that they arrive in the room softened and blurred, like sounds heard through a thick blanket. Closer sounds come from the building itself, and the most regular of these is the ticking of the wood as it expands and contracts with the changing temperature of the day. This ticking is not loud, but it is distinct, and it happens at irregular intervals, sometimes 3 or 4 ticks in quick succession, and then a long silence followed by a single tick from somewhere near the window frame. The pipes in the walls make occasional sounds as well, a low gurgling when someone somewhere else in the building runs water, and a soft knocking that travels through the metal when the pressure changes suddenly. These pipe sounds are muffled by the plaster, but they are still audible if you listen carefully, and they have a hollow quality that makes them seem to come from everywhere at once. From the air shaft outside there is a constant faint sound of moving air that rises and falls in pitch as the wind shifts above the rooftops. This sound is like a distant sigh that never quite stops, and it carries with it the occasional echo of a door closing somewhere far below or the faint clink of a pot being set down on a stove. These sounds travel up the shaft in strange ways, bouncing off the brick walls so that they arrive at your window stripped of their source and rendered into pure sound with no clear origin or direction. A voice from 5 floors below might reach you as a soft murmur that seems to come from the wall beside your head, and you cannot tell if it is a man or a woman or even what language is being spoken. The smell in the room is a complex thing that changes subtly as the day progresses and as the air moves through the small gaps around the window and under the door. In the morning there is often a cool, damp smell that rises from the air shaft, bringing with it the scent of wet brick and old mortar and the faint mustiness of the cellar far below. This smell is earthy and mineral, and it has a slight sharpness to it, like the smell of stone after a rain, even when no rain has fallen for days. As the day warms, the smell shifts and other notes emerge from the walls and the floor and the ceiling. There's the dry, dusty smell of old plaster and the slightly sweet smell of aged pine wood that has been warming slowly in the indirect light. There is also the faint trace of coal smoke that has seeped into every porous surface of the building over many winters, so that even in summer the room holds a ghost of that acrid warmth. Cooking smells drift up through the building in ways that are hard to predict, and they arrive in the room through the gap under the door and through the small cracks around the window frame. Sometimes there is the smell of boiling cabbage, which is a soft green smell with a slight sulphurous edge that lingers in the air for hours after the cooking has stopped. Other times there is the smell of bread baking somewhere far below, which is a warm, yeasty smell that makes the room feel somehow smaller and more enclosed. These smells are never strong or overwhelming, but rather they are faint suggestions that you notice for a moment and then forget until they shift and change, and a new scent takes their place. The light in the room follows a slow and predictable path across the walls and floor as the sun moves across the sky far above the narrow slot of the air shaft. In the early morning, the light is almost non-existent, and the room is filled with a soft grey dimness that makes the corners disappear into shadow and the walls seem to recede away from you. Around 10 in the morning, a pale beam of light begins to creep down the opposite brick wall of the air shaft, and this light reflects into the room with a cool, silvery quality that brightens the space just enough to read by if you were to hold a book close to the window. By noon, the light has traveled down to the level of the window itself, and a small rectangle of brightness falls across the floor just inside the sill. This rectangle is about the size of a folded newspaper, and it moves so slowly that you cannot see it change. But if you mark its position with a small object and return an hour later, you will find that it has shifted by several inches. The afternoon brings the brightest light of the day, though bright is a relative term in this room. Around 2 in the afternoon, the sun manages to angle itself in such a way that a beam of direct light finds the upper corner of the window, and for about 20 minutes there is a warm golden glow that falls on the ceiling near the window wall. This glow is soft and diffuse because it has passed through the wavy old glass, and it creates a small patch of warmth on the plaster that you can see but not feel from where you stand. The light catches the dust motes that hang in the air, and they become visible as tiny floating specks that drift slowly on currents, too gentle to feel. These dust motes rise and fall in the beam of light, and they sparkle for a moment before drifting back into the dimmer air where they disappear from sight. As the afternoon wears on, the light begins to fade, and the rectangle on the floor shrinks and retreats back toward the window until it is nothing more than a thin, bright line on the sill, and then it is gone altogether. The room returns to its soft grey dimness, and the shadows in the corners deepen and spread outward toward the center of the space. By evening there is almost no light at all coming through the window, and the only illumination comes from the thin slice of hallway light that slips under the door. This light is a warm yellowish color because it comes from a gas jet somewhere down the hall, and it creates a faint glow along the bottom edge of the door that is just bright enough to make out the shapes of the nearest floorboards. The temperature in the room changes with the light, but in a slower and more gradual way, so that the warmest part of the day is not noon, but late afternoon, when the brick walls have had time to absorb the heat from the sun and radiate it back into the interior spaces. The walls feel cool to the touch in the morning, and they remain cool until early afternoon, when they begin to warm slightly, starting with the wall that faces the air shaft and spreading slowly to the other 3 walls by evening. In winter the walls are always cold, and they seem to draw the warmth out of the air and out of your body if you stand too close to them for too long. In summer they hold the coolness of the night well into the morning hours, and this provides a small relief from the heat that builds up in the city streets outside. The room is empty of furniture and empty of people, and it has been this way for some time, though you can see the marks and traces of those who lived here before. There are small holes in the plaster near the window where nails once held curtains, and these holes are surrounded by faint rust stains that have bled into the paint. The floorboards near the door have a series of shallow dents and scratches that form a pattern, suggesting where a chair once sat, and where feet rested in a particular position. The wall beside where a bed would have been placed shows a faint darkening of the paint at about the height of a headboard, where oils from hair and skin slowly transferred to the plaster over many nights of sleep. These traces are so subtle that you might not notice them unless you stood in the room for a long time and let your eyes adjust to the dim light and the quiet stillness. They are not signs of any particular person or any particular story, but simply the accumulated evidence of ordinary life lived within these 4 walls. The room holds these marks the way a stone holds the memory of the water that once flowed over it, and they will remain here until the plaster is patched or the floor is sanded or the building itself is taken down and replaced with something new. For now the room continues to exist in its quiet state, with the light moving across the floor in its slow daily arc, and the sounds of the building and the city drifting through the walls and the air shaft. The dust settles on the windowsill in a fine even layer, and a single cobweb stretches from the corner of the door frame to the wall beside it, trembling slightly in the current of air that slips under the door. Nothing happens, and nothing changes in any way that matters, and the room simply waits in its dim grey stillness for the next hour, and the hour after that, and all the hours that will follow, until the light fails completely and the building settles into the deeper quiet of the night. The water for this building comes from a single pump located in the rear courtyard, and it has been this way since the house was first built. The pump is a simple cast iron mechanism that stands in the center of a small paved area, surrounded on 3 sides by the brick walls of the tenement, and on the 4th side by a high wooden fence that separates this yard from the one behind it. The courtyard itself is not large, perhaps 20 feet across in one direction, and 15 in the other, and the ground is covered with irregular flagstones that have settled unevenly over the years, so that some are higher than others, and puddles form in the low spots after rain or after heavy use of the pump. The pump handle is a long, curved piece of iron that extends outward from the main body of the pump, like an arm reaching toward the ground. It is painted black, though the paint is worn away in the middle section, where hands grip it, leaving a smooth, shiny patch of bare metal that is slightly darker than the painted areas. The handle is cool to the touch in the early morning, and it grows warmer as the day progresses and the sun reaches into this corner of the yard. At the top of the pump, there is a spout that curves downward, and a small bucket or basin is usually placed beneath it to catch the water as it flows out. The spout is green with age, and there is a thin layer of mineral deposit around its lip, where the water has dripped and dried countless times, leaving behind a white, crusty ring that builds up slowly over the months and years. When you approach the pump in the early morning, you will find that the courtyard is quiet and still, and the only sound is the distant noise of the city waking up beyond the walls. The flagstones beneath your feet are damp from the night air, and they have a dark grey color that lightens as the morning progresses and the moisture evaporates. The air in the courtyard is cool, and it carries the smell of wet stone and the faint mustiness of the cellar door that opens onto this space. You bring with you a wooden bucket that you have carried down the stairs and through the long hallway, and it swings gently at your side as you walk with a soft creaking sound from the wire handle that loops through the wooden stave. The bucket itself is made of wooden slats bound together by two metal hoops, one near the top and one near the bottom. The wood is a pale blonde color, where it has been scraped and scrubbed over time, but the grain is dark and pronounced, and there are small gaps between the slats that close up when the wood swells with moisture. The bucket is empty now, and it is light in your hand, though you can feel the slight weight of the metal hoops and the handle and the wooden bottom that fits snugly into a groove cut into the lower edge of each slat. The inside of the bucket is smooth and damp from its last use, and there is a faint smell of clean water and old wood that rises from it as you walk. You set the bucket down on the flagstone beneath the pump spout, and it makes a soft hollow sound as the wooden bottom meets the stone. The bucket sits slightly tilted because the stone is not perfectly level, and you adjust it with your foot until it is stable and centered under the spout. Then you take hold of the pump handle with both hands one above the other, and you begin to work the handle up and down in a slow, steady rhythm. The first few strokes produce only a dry, squeaking sound as the leather seal inside the pump moves against the iron cylinder, and there is no water yet, only the resistance of the mechanism and the sound of your own breathing in the quiet morning air. After perhaps 6 or 8 strokes, you hear a change in the sound, a deep gurgling that comes from somewhere far down in the pipe below the ground. This sound grows louder with each stroke, and it is followed by a wet, sucking noise as the water begins to rise through the column of the pump. You continue to move the handle up and down, and you can feel the resistance change as the water fills the cylinder and the weight of it presses against the valve inside. The handle becomes slightly harder to push down and easier to pull up, and this new rhythm is the rhythm of water being lifted from the dark underground place where it lives to the bright surface of the yard. The first water comes out in a sudden gush that splashes against the side of the bucket and makes a hollow drumming sound that echoes off the brick walls around you. The flow is irregular at first, spurting and pausing as the pump finds its proper pace, but soon it steadies into a continuous stream that pours from the spout in a thick silvery rope that twists slightly as it falls. The sound of the water hitting the wooden bottom of the bucket is a clear ringing note that changes as the bucket fills and the water level rises. At first it is a high, bright sound like a bell struck softly, and then it deepens and becomes more muted as the water covers the bottom and begins to climb up the sides of the bucket. You watch the water rise, and you can see the surface trembling and shimmering in the grey morning light. The water is clear, but it has a slight brownish tint when you look through it toward the bottom of the bucket, and this comes from the iron pipes and the minerals in the ground through which it has traveled. There are tiny bubbles clinging to the inside of the bucket, and they drift slowly upward and pop when they reach the surface, leaving behind small rings that expand and disappear. The smell of the water is faint and clean, with a slight metallic edge that comes from the iron of the pump and the pipes. When the bucket is nearly full, you slow the rhythm of the handle and the stream of water diminishes to a trickle, and then to a series of drops that fall one by one into the bucket, each one making a small plinking sound that is distinct and separate from the others. You stop pumping, and the handle comes to rest in its lowest position with a soft clunk of iron against iron. The courtyard falls silent again, except for the faint dripping from the spout and the distant sounds of the city that drift over the walls like a low, constant murmur. You bend down and take hold of the wire handle of the bucket, and you lift it carefully with both hands because it is heavy now, and the weight of the water changes the way the bucket behaves. The handle digs into your palms and the wire creaks softly as it takes the strain, and you can feel the water sloshing gently inside the bucket, a slow back and forth movement that you must compensate for with small adjustments of your grip and your posture. The bucket weighs about 40 pounds when it is full, and this weight pulls downward on your arms and shoulders, and you can feel it in your lower back as you begin to walk back toward the door that leads into the building. The journey from the pump to the stairway is a short one, but it takes time because you must walk slowly and carefully to avoid spilling the water. The flagstones are uneven, and you watch your feet as you move, placing each step with deliberate care and feeling for the slight tilts and dips in the surface. The water in the bucket moves with your steps, and it sloshes against the wooden sides in a rhythm that matches your walking. Sometimes a small amount of water laps over the edge and runs down the outside of the bucket, leaving a dark, wet trail on the pale wood that will dry in a few minutes and leave no mark. You reach the door, and you must set the bucket down for a moment to open it, because you cannot manage both the heavy bucket and the door latch at the same time. The bucket rests on the stone threshold, and you can see the surface of the water trembling from the movement and then slowly settling into stillness. You open the door and prop it with your foot, and then you lift the bucket again and step through into the dim hallway. The change from the grey morning light of the courtyard to the brownish shadow of the hallway is sudden, and your eyes take a moment to adjust to the darkness. The bucket seems heavier in here, as if the enclosed space adds something to its weight, and the sound of the water sloshing is louder and more resonant between the close walls. The hallway stretches before you long and narrow, and the stairs are at the far end. You begin to walk, and your footsteps are slow and measured, and the water in the bucket moves in a steady rhythm, sloshing forward as you step forward and sloshing back as you bring your other foot forward. This rhythm is regular and predictable, and after a while you stop noticing it as something separate from the act of walking itself. The water has its own small voice that accompanies you down the hallway, a soft liquid sound that fills the silence between the creaks of the floorboards beneath your feet. The stairs present a different challenge because each step is a small rise that requires you to lift the bucket slightly and then set it down again as you climb. The bucket handle digs deeper into your palms on the upward pull, and you can feel the muscles in your forearms working to keep the bucket steady and level. You climb slowly, one step at a time, and you can hear the water sloshing in a more irregular pattern now, as the bucket tips slightly forward with each upward movement, and then settles back as you plant your foot on the next tread. The stairwell is narrow, and the walls are close on either side, and the sound of your breathing and the sloshing of the water and the creaking of the old wooden steps all blend together into a single quiet rhythm that marks your progress upward. At the first landing, you pause and set the bucket down on the floor while you rest for a moment. The bucket sits on the worn pine boards, and the surface of the water trembles and then grows still, and you can see your own reflection in it, a dim, shadowy shape that looks back at you from the dark water. The landing window lets in a pale grey light that falls across the floor and touches the side of the bucket, making the wet wood gleam softly. You can hear the sounds of the building around you, the distant closing of a door somewhere below, and the faint murmur of voices through the walls, and the ever-present hum of the city that vibrates through the brick and the plaster and the wood. After a short time, you lift the bucket again and continue up the second flight of stairs. This flight is shorter than the first, and the steps are slightly less worn because fewer feet travel this high in the building. The water sloshes in a different pattern here, because you are more tired now and your movements are slightly less steady, and the bucket tips and sways in small, unpredictable ways. A few drops of water escape over the edge and fall onto the stair tread, leaving small dark spots in the pale wood that will dry and disappear within minutes. You watch these spots as you climb, and they mark your progress upward like a trail of small dark coins scattered on the steps. At the top of the second flight, you step onto the hallway of your floor, and you are grateful for the level surface beneath your feet. The bucket feels heavier than ever now, and your arms and shoulders ache with a dull, steady pain that you have grown accustomed to over the weeks and months of this routine. You walk down the hallway, and the water sloshes in that familiar rhythm again, and the sound of it fills the narrow space and bounces off the closed doors on either side. The hallway is dim and quiet, and the only light comes from the window at the far end, and from the thin lines of brightness that slip under the doors of the apartments where people are already awake and moving about their morning routines. You reach your own door, and you must set the bucket down once more to open it. The bucket rests on the floorboards, and you can see the water inside trembling, and then slowly calming, and the surface becomes smooth and dark and reflective. You open the door and lift the bucket and step inside your own small room, where the light from the window falls across the floor in a pale rectangle, and the air is still and cool and smells of old plaster and dust. You carry the bucket to the corner where you keep it, and you set it down carefully on the floorboards, and you can feel the relief in your arms and shoulders as the weight leaves your hands. The bucket sits in its place, and the water inside is still now, and the surface reflects the light from the window in a small bright patch that wavers slightly when you walk past. The water will be used throughout the day for washing and for cooking and for drinking, and each time you dip a cup or a basin into it, the level will drop by a small amount and the weight of the bucket will decrease accordingly. By evening, the bucket will be nearly empty, and you will carry it down the stairs and across the courtyard to the pump once more, and the entire routine will repeat itself, as it does every day and as it has done for all the years that this building has stood on this spot. The water itself comes from a deep well that was dug long ago and lined with brick and stone, and it reaches down through the layers of soil and clay and gravel to the underground stream that flows beneath the city. This water is cold even in summer, and it tastes of minerals and of the earth through which it has traveled, and it is the same water that everyone in this building drinks and washes with and uses for their daily needs. The pump in the courtyard is the only source, and so there is always someone coming or going with a bucket or a pitcher or a basin, and the flagstones around the pump are always damp from the water that spills and drips throughout the day. The routine of carrying water is a quiet and repetitive thing that takes time and effort, and it shapes the rhythm of each day in small but significant ways. There is the first trip in the early morning, when the courtyard is still cool and the pump handle is cold to the touch, and the water comes out clear and fresh from the long night underground. There is the second trip in the late morning, when the sun has reached the courtyard and the pump handle is warm and the water flows with a slightly different sound because the pipes have expanded in the heat. There is the afternoon trip, when the courtyard is full of shadows, and the flagstones are warm underfoot, and the water seems heavier somehow, as if the heat of the day has added something to its weight. And there is the evening trip, when the light is fading and the courtyard is quiet and the water comes out cold and dark, and you can hear the sound of it echoing off the brick walls in the growing dusk. Each trip is the same, and each trip is slightly different because the light changes and the temperature changes, and your own body feels different at different times of the day. But the essential act remains constant and unchanging. The lifting of the handle, the gurgle of water rising the steady stream, falling into the bucket, and the slow, careful walk back up the stairs with the weight pulling at your arms and the water sloshing in its wooden container. This is the source of water for this building, and this is how it moves from the dark underground place to the small rooms where people live, and this is how it has always been, and how it will continue to be for as long as the building stands and the pump holds and the water flows beneath the city streets. The small cast iron stove stands in the corner of the room against the wall that faces the interior of the building, and it is the source of all warmth during the cold months of the year. The stove is not large, perhaps 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, and it sits on 4 short iron legs that raise it about 4 inches off the floorboards. The iron itself is a dark greyish-black color that has been seasoned by years of heat and cooling, and there is a fine layer of ash dust that clings to every surface despite regular wiping. The stove has a rectangular firebox with a small door on the front that swings open on iron hinges, and inside this door there is a smaller circular opening with a sliding draft cover that can be adjusted to control the flow of air into the fire. The top of the stove is a flat cooking surface made of a single piece of iron, with a round removable lid in the center that can be lifted out using a small iron handle that hangs from a hook on the side of the stove. This lid is slightly warped from years of heat, and it does not sit perfectly flush with the surrounding surface, so that a thin line of orange light escapes around its edge when the fire is burning bright inside. The stovepipe rises from a collar at the back of the stove, and it travels upward at a slight angle until it enters a hole cut into the plaster ceiling where it connects to the flue that runs through the building. The pipe is made of thin sheet iron that has been blackened by soot, and there are faint horizontal lines visible where the sections of pipe join together. A small damper handle protrudes from the side of the pipe near the ceiling, and this can be turned to open or close a metal plate inside the pipe that regulates the draft. The coal for the stove is kept in a small hod that sits on the floor beside the stove within easy reach. The hod is made of galvanized metal with a wire handle, and it holds perhaps 15 pounds of coal when it is full. The coal itself is a type called anthracite that burns hot and slow with very little smoke, and it comes in irregular lumps that range in size from a walnut to a fist. The surface of each lump is black and shiny, with sharp edges that catch the light, and there is a fine black dust that coats everything inside the hod and transfers to your hands when you handle the coal. This dust is so fine that it works its way into the lines of your palms and under your fingernails, and it takes soap and scrubbing to remove it completely. The morning routine with the stove begins in the cold darkness, before the sun has risen high enough to send any light down the air shaft. The room is cold, and you can feel the chill on your face and hands as you move about in the dimness. The stove from the night before has cooled, and the firebox contains only grey ashes and a few small unburned pieces of coal that are black and cold to the touch. You kneel before the stove and open the small door, and the smell of cold ash and old iron rises up to meet you. A dry, dusty smell that is not unpleasant, but simply the smell of something that has burned out and cooled. The first task is to riddle the ashes, which means shaking the grate inside the firebox, so that the fine ash falls through into the ash pan below, while the larger unburned pieces remain above. You take hold of the small handle that protrudes from the front of the stove just below the door, and you move it back and forth in a short, quick motion. The grate inside moves with a grating sound of iron against iron, and you can hear the soft hiss of ash falling into the pan below. A small cloud of fine grey dust puffs out from the gaps around the door and settles on the floorboards in a thin film that you will wipe up later. The handle moves with a certain resistance, and you can feel the vibration of the grate shaking through your hand and up into your wrist. When the riddling is finished, you open the small door fully and look inside at the firebox, which is now mostly empty except for a few small pieces of coal that were too large to fall through the grate. These pieces are dull black, and they show no sign of heat, and they sit on the iron bars like small dark stones in a cold stream bed. You reach into the hod and select several fresh lumps of coal, and you arrange them carefully in the firebox, placing the larger pieces toward the back and the smaller ones toward the front. The coal is cold and hard, and it makes a small clinking sound as you set each piece down on the iron grate. The next step is to prepare the kindling that will catch the flame and ignite the coal. You take a small handful of wood shavings that you keep in a paper bag near the stove, and you arrange them in a loose pile in the front of the firebox where the draft will reach them most easily. The shavings are thin and curly, and they have a pale golden color that is much lighter than anything else in the room. On top of the shavings you place a few small sticks of dry pine that have been split into thin pieces no thicker than your finger. The pine has a sharp resinous smell that rises from the kindling, and it reminds you of forests and of the outdoors, even though you are in the middle of a brick building in the heart of the city. You take a match from a small tin box that sits on the mantel above the stove. The match is a thin splinter of wood with a red head that smells of sulfur and phosphorus, and you strike it against the rough strip on the side of the box. The match flares with a sudden hiss and a bright yellow flame that wavers and dances in the draught from the open stove door. You touch the flame to the wood shavings, and they catch immediately, with a soft crackling sound that grows louder as the fire spreads through the thin, dry curls of wood. The pine sticks catch next, and they burn with a brighter, hotter flame that is tinged with orange and blue at the base, and the smell of burning pine fills the room, a sharp, clean smell that cuts through the cold morning air. You watch the fire for a moment as it takes hold of the kindling, and you can see the flames licking upward toward the fresh coal above. The coal does not catch right away because it needs more heat than the kindling can provide, but you can see the surface of the lumps begin to change as the flames play over them. The shiny black surface dulls slightly, and small cracks appear, and a faint wisp of smoke begins to rise from the edges. You close the stove door, but you leave the small draft cover open so that air can flow in through the bottom and feed the growing fire. The sound of the fire changes as it grows, and you can hear it through the iron walls of the stove. At first there is only the crackle of the kindling and the soft rush of air being drawn through the draft opening, but after a few minutes you begin to hear a deeper sound, a low, steady roar that comes from the coal beginning to burn in earnest. This sound is constant and even, and it fills the room with a presence that is both audible and felt as a subtle vibration that travels through the floorboards and into your feet if you stand close to the stove. The warmth from the stove takes time to spread through the room, and the first sign of it is the smell of hot iron that rises from the surface of the stove as the metal begins to absorb the heat from within. This smell is clean and slightly metallic, and it is different from the smell of the burning coal, which is sharper and more acrid. You can place your hand near the side of the stove and feel the warmth radiating outward in invisible waves that grow stronger as the minutes pass. The iron expands as it heats, and you can hear small ticking sounds coming from the stove and from the stovepipe as the metal adjusts to the changing temperature. These ticks are irregular and quiet, and they punctuate the steady roar of the fire like small notes in a long, slow piece of music. The cold in the room does not retreat all at once, but rather it gives way gradually from the center outward. The everyday hystist of all warms first, and you can feel a small pocket of heat forming around the iron body of the stove, while the corners of the room remain cold and untouched. The window glass remains cold, and if you touch it with your fingertip, you will feel the chill that radiates from the outside air, and you may see a small patch of condensation form where your warm finger meets the cold surface. The exterior wall is cold as well, and it seems to draw the heat out of the air and out of your body if you stand too close to it for too long. As the stove continues to burn, the warmth spreads slowly through the room in ways that you can observe if you pay close attention. The air near the ceiling warms before the air near the floor because heat rises, and the warmest part of the room is always just below the plaster ceiling, where a layer of heated air collects and slowly thickens. The floorboards remain cold for the longest time, especially near the exterior wall, where the cold from outside seeps up through the foundation and into the wood. You can feel the temperature difference on your bare feet as you walk from the stove side of the room to the window side, and the change is gradual but distinct, like walking from summer into autumn in the space of a few steps. The stove requires regular attention throughout the day to keep the fire burning at the right temperature. You must add fresh coal at intervals when you see the glow inside beginning to fade and the roar of the fire beginning to soften into a gentler sound. Adding coal is a simple process that involves opening the small door and placing several fresh lumps onto the burning bed of coals inside. The new coal sits on top of the glowing mass, and at first it appears unchanged, just black lumps resting on orange heat. But after a few minutes the edges begin to glow and small blue flames appear around the surface, and the new coal becomes part of the fire and begins to give off its own heat. The ash pan beneath the grate must be emptied periodically, because it fills with fine grey ash that falls through the bars as the coal burns. You slide the ash pan out from beneath the stove, and it is surprisingly heavy because the ash is dense and compacted, and it has a soft grey colour like the fur of a mouse. You carry the ash pan carefully down the stairs and out to the yard, where you empty it onto the ash pile that accumulates against the back wall. The ash falls in a soft, silent cloud that settles onto the pile and mingles with the ash from all the other stoves in the building. This pile grows slowly over the winter months, and it will be carted away in the spring. But for now it sits against the brick wall, a soft grey mound that is warm to the touch even hours after the ash was first deposited. The management of the stove draft is a subtle art that you learn through practice and observation. The small sliding cover on the door controls the amount of air that enters the firebox, and this in turn controls the rate at which the coal burns. If you open the draft fully, the fire roars and the coal burns hot and fast, and the room warms quickly, but the coal is consumed more rapidly. If you close the draft partially, the fire settles into a slower, steadier burn that produces a gentler heat that lasts longer through the day. You learn to read the sound of the fire and the color of the glow visible through the small gaps around the door, and you adjust the draft accordingly, moving the small iron slide with your fingertip until the sound is right and the warmth is even and constant. The stove has a particular smell that fills the room and lingers in the fabric of the curtains and the clothes hanging on the wall. This smell is a combination of hot iron and burning coal and the faint sweetness of wood smoke that escapes when you open the door to add fresh fuel. It is not an unpleasant smell, but rather a warm and familiar one that signals comfort and shelter against the cold outside. The smell clings to your hair and your clothing, and you carry it with you when you leave the room, so that anyone you pass in the hallway will know that you have been tending a fire. In the evening, when the light has faded and the room is lit only by the soft orange glow that escapes from the gaps around the stove door, the fire takes on a different character. The sound is lower and steadier, and it blends with the quiet sounds of the building settling around you. The warmth is most welcome at this hour, and you may draw a chair close to the stove and sit for a while feeling the heat on your face and hands, and listening to the soft tick of expanding metal and the distant hum of the city beyond the walls. The stove glows in the corner like a small warm heart, and it pushes back against the cold that presses in from the window and the exterior wall and the floor. Before you go to sleep, you make a final adjustment to the stove, adding enough coal to last through the night and setting the draft so that the fire will burn slowly and steadily until morning. You close the small sliding cover almost all the way, leaving just a narrow gap for the air to enter, and you can hear the fire settle into a low, deep sound that is more felt than heard. The glow inside the firebox is a soft orange that pulses gently with the movement of the air, and it casts faint shadows on the ceiling that shift and change as the night progresses. The stove will burn through the night, and the room will remain warm enough, though the temperature will drop by morning, and the chill will have crept back into the corners, and the floor will be cold underfoot once again. But for now, as you settle into the quiet darkness, the stove continues its slow work, converting the black lumps of coal into heat and light, and the soft sound of the fire fills the room like a quiet breath that rises and falls and never quite stops. The walls hold the warmth as long as they can, and then they release it slowly into the cold night air, and the cycle will begin again in the morning, when you rise in the darkness and kneel before the cold iron and begin the process of riddling the ashes and arranging the fresh coal and striking the match that will bring the fire back to life. The work of mending and stitching is a quiet occupation that fills many hours of the day and evening in this small room. The materials for the work are kept in a simple basket that sits on the floor beside the chair near the window where the light is strongest. The basket is made of woven splints of ash wood that have darkened with age and handling to a warm honey brown color, and the rim is bound with a strip of leather that has cracked and softened over time. Inside the basket, there are spools of thread in several shades of grey and brown and cream, along with a small pincushion shaped like a tomato and a pair of iron scissors that have a faint bloom of rust on the inner surfaces of the blades. The work itself consists of sewing seams on simple garments that arrive in bundles from a shop somewhere in the city. The garments are cut from coarse linen or wool or cotton cloth, and the pieces are stacked in a neat pile inside a paper wrapper that has been folded and refolded many times, until the creases are soft and furry at the edges. Each bundle contains enough cut pieces to make perhaps half a dozen shirts or a dozen aprons or a quantity of simple undergarments, and the pieces are all the same size and shape because the cutting was done by someone else in a different room far away. Your task is to join these pieces together along the seams using small, even stitches that must be consistent in length and tension, because the finished garments will be inspected and any irregular work will be rejected and returned. You sit in a straight-backed wooden chair that you have positioned so that the light from the window falls over your left shoulder onto the work in your lap. The chair has a woven seat of rush that has sagged slightly in the center from years of use, and it makes a soft creaking sound when you shift your weight. The back of the chair is made of 2 vertical spindles and a curved top rail that fits against the hollow of your back, and you have learned to sit in a particular way that allows you to work for long periods without too much discomfort, though a certain stiffness in the shoulders and neck is unavoidable after the first hour or two. The first piece of the day is taken from the bundle, and you smooth it out on your lap, running your palm over the fabric to flatten any wrinkles that have formed during storage. The cloth has a particular smell that varies depending on the type of fabric. The linen smells dry and clean, and slightly dusty like a stack of old letters, while the wool has a deeper animal smell that is warm and faintly oily, and the cotton smells of nothing much at all except perhaps the faint starch that was used in its finishing. This smell rises from the fabric as you handle it, and it becomes a familiar presence that you stop noticing after a while, much like the sound of the fire in the stove or the distant hum of the city. You select a spool of thread from the basket, and you pull a length of it free, and you cut it with the iron scissors. The scissors make a soft, grinding sound as the blades come together and the thread parts with a small, clean snap that you feel more than hear. You hold the cut end of the thread up to the light and you moisten it slightly between your lips to stiffen the fibers, and then you pass it through the eye of the needle. The needle is a slender piece of polished steel, about 2 inches long, with a small oval eye at one end and a sharp point at the other. It is cool to the touch and it has a particular weight in your fingers that you have grown accustomed to over the many hours of work. The thread passes through the eye and you pull it through until the two ends are even, and then you make a small knot at the end by looping the thread around your forefinger and rolling it off with your thumb. The first seam is a simple straight line that joins two pieces of fabric along their edges. You align the pieces carefully so that the raw edges are even and the right sides of the fabric face each other, and you hold them together between the thumb and forefinger of your left hand. The needle in your right hand pierces the fabric and you pull it through until the knot catches against the underside of the cloth with a tiny resistance that you feel in your fingertips. The needle comes up through the fabric again a short distance ahead of the first stitch, and you draw the thread through with a steady, even pull that tightens the stitch without puckering the cloth. The rhythm of the stitching is slow and regular, and it takes a few minutes to establish the proper pace. Each stitch is made in the same way, with the needle piercing down through the two layers of fabric and then coming up again a small distance ahead. The distance between stitches is measured by eye and by feel, and after many hours of practice you no longer think about it consciously, because your fingers have learned the spacing and they maintain it automatically. The thread pulls through the fabric with a soft whispering sound that is almost inaudible, and the needle makes a small ticking sound when it strikes the thimble on your middle finger as you push it through the thicker parts of the seam. The thimble is made of brass, and it fits snugly on the tip of your middle finger with a pattern of small dimples pressed into its surface to catch the end of the needle and prevent it from slipping. The brass is tarnished to a dark brown color, except on the very tip, where constant contact with the needle has polished it to a bright gold shine. The thimble makes a soft metallic sound when the needle strikes it, a tiny click that punctuates each stitch like a small clock marking the passage of seconds. This sound blends with the creak of the chair and the distant sounds of the building and the soft rush of the fire in the stove to create a quiet background that fills the room without demanding attention. As you sew, the seam grows longer and the stitched portion extends from your fingers and falls into your lap in a soft fold of fabric. The stitches themselves are small and even, and they form a straight line that is barely visible on the right side of the fabric when you turn it over to check your work. On the wrong side, the thread lies in a series of small diagonal lines that overlap slightly where each new stitch begins. The color of the thread matches the fabric closely enough that the stitches blend into the cloth and become part of its texture rather than standing out as separate marks. The light from the window moves across the floor and across your lap as the morning progresses, and you must adjust your position slightly from time to time to keep the work well illuminated. The best light is the indirect grey light of mid-morning, when the sun is high enough to brighten the air shaft, but not yet angled in such a way as to cast harsh shadows. This light falls evenly on the fabric and makes the individual threads of the weave visible as a fine grid of crossing lines. You can see the texture of the cloth clearly in this light, and you can also see any small imperfections in your stitching that might need to be corrected. The work requires a certain amount of attention, but it does not require your full conscious thought, and so your mind is free to wander as your hands continue their steady, repetitive motion. You might think about the number of stitches in the scene you're working on, and you might count them silently as you go, though you will lose count after a while and have to start over. You might think about the number of seams you have sewn this week, and the number of bundles you have completed, and the amount of money that will be paid for each finished piece. The payment is small and it is calculated by the dozen, so that each individual garment represents only a fraction of a cent of earnings. But the numbers are not important in the moment, and they drift through your mind like the dust motes in the beam of light, and then they are gone. The physical sensations of the work become more noticeable as the hours pass. There is a slight ache that develops in the muscles between your shoulder blades from the posture of leaning slightly forward over the work. There is a stiffness in the joints of your right hand from the repetitive motion of pushing the needle through the fabric and pulling it through and pushing it through again. There is a small callus on the side of your middle finger where the thimble sits, and another callus on the pad of your thumb where you grip the needle. These sensations are not painful in any sharp way, but rather they are a dull, constant presence that you learn to accept and then to ignore as the work continues. The seam is finished when you reach the end of the fabric, and you make several small back stitches to secure the thread before cutting it free. The back stitches overlap the last few regular stitches, and they create a small thickened area at the end of the seam that will help prevent the stitching from pulling out when the garment is worn and washed. You snick the thread close to the fabric with the scissors, and you hear that same soft grinding sound and feel the slight resistance as the blades cut through the twisted cotton fibers. The finished seam lies flat and smooth, and you run your thumb along it to check for any puckers or loose loops that might need to be redone. The next seam is the same as the first, and the one after that is the same as well. A shirt requires perhaps a dozen separate seams if you count the side seams and the sleeve seams and the shoulder seams and the seams that attach the collar and the cuffs. An apron requires fewer seams, but they are longer and they take nearly as much time to complete. Each seam is a straight line that follows the edge of the fabric, and each stitch is the same length as the one before it and the one after it. The work is repetitive in the truest sense of the word, a repetition of small, identical actions that accumulate slowly into a finished garment, and then into a finished bundle, and then into a small sum of money at the end of the week. The sound of the stitching fills the quiet room, and it becomes a kind of music that you stop hearing consciously after a while. The needle ticks against the thimble, and the thread whispers through the fabric, and the scissors grind softly when you cut a new length of thread. These sounds repeat in a cycle that lasts perhaps 30 seconds for each new length of thread, and then begins again. The cycle is punctuated by longer pauses when you finish a seam and set the piece aside and take up the next one from the pile. In these pauses, you might stretch your fingers and roll your shoulders and look out the window at the brick wall opposite and see that the light has shifted slightly since the last time you looked. The pile of finished pieces grows slowly on the chair beside you, or on the floor where you have placed a clean cloth to keep them from picking up dust. The finished pieces are soft and limp, and they have a different quality than the flat-cut pieces that remain in the bundle. A finished garment has a certain weight and drape that comes from the seams and the way the fabric is joined together, and it begins to resemble the thing it will become when it is worn by someone somewhere else. You do not know who will wear these garments, and you will never see them being worn, but you imagine them sometimes as you sew the seams that will hold the fabric together against the movements of an unknown body. The afternoon light changes, and it becomes warmer in color as the sun moves lower in the sky and the brick wall opposite catches a faint golden glow that reflects into the room. This light is not as good for sewing because it casts stronger shadows and makes it harder to see the individual stitches clearly. You might pause in your work during this hour and rest your eyes by looking out the window at the wall and the small patch of sky visible at the very top of the air shaft. The sky is a pale grey or a soft blue or a hazy white, depending on the weather, and it is the only part of the outside world that you can see from this position. The work continues into the evening if there is enough light, or if you light the oil lamp and position it carefully so that the flame illuminates the fabric without casting your own shadow across the work. The lamplight is warmer and yellower than daylight, and it changes the colors of the thread and the fabric in subtle ways that you must adjust to. The stitches look slightly different in lamplight, and you must rely more on touch and on habit than on vision to maintain the even spacing and tension. The lamp flickers occasionally when a draft moves through the room and the shadows on the wall shift and dance for a moment, before settling back into stillness. The last seam of the day is finished, and you set the needle down and flex your fingers and feel the stiffness in your hands that comes from holding the same position for so long. You gather the finished pieces and stack them neatly and count them to be sure that you have completed the number you intended to complete. The unfinished pieces remain in the basket or in the paper wrapper, and they will wait for you until tomorrow when you will take them up again and continue the work from where you left off. The needle is stuck into the pincushion, and the thread is wound around the spool, and the scissors are placed beside the basket, and everything is returned to its proper place. The work of mending and stitching is a quiet thing that leaves little trace behind except the finished garments themselves, which will be taken away and sold and worn and eventually worn out and discarded. The only evidence of the hours spent sewing is the small callus on your finger and the slight ache in your shoulders and the faint smell of linen and wool that clings to your clothing and your hands. But these traces fade quickly, and by morning there is nothing left of yesterday's work except the memory of the rhythm and the readiness of your fingers to begin again when you sit down in the chair by the window and take up the needle and the thread and the first piece of the new day. The window that looks out onto the street is not the same window that faces the airshaft, but rather a different one, located at the end of the hallway on the third floor, and you have walked to this spot in the late morning to stand and look out at the world beyond the building. This window is larger than the one in the small room, and it has 8 panes of glass instead of 6. And the glass is slightly clearer, though still imperfect, with small waves and bubbles that distort the view in subtle ways. The wooden frame is painted the same dark brown as all the other woodwork in the building, and the paint has crackled into a fine network of lines that catch the light when you stand close. The sill is deeper here, perhaps 8 inches across, and it has been worn smooth in the center, where people have leaned their forearms to look out over the years. The street below is a narrow canyon that runs between 2 rows of buildings that rise up on either side to heights of 4 or 5 or 6 stories. The buildings are made of the same dark red brick as this one, and they form a nearly continuous wall, broken only by the occasional cross street or narrow alley that slices through the block at irregular intervals. The facades are flat and plain, with rows of windows that mirror the windows of this building and fire escapes that zigzag down the faces in dark iron staircases that cast sharp shadows when the sun is at the right angle. The street itself is paved with cobblestones that were laid many years ago and have been worn smooth by the passage of countless iron-rimmed wheels and the steady tread of horseshoes and the shuffling of innumerable feet. If you look straight down from the window, you can see the sidewalk directly below, and the edge of the street where the cobblestones begin. The sidewalk is made of the same large stone slabs as the one in front of the building entrance, and they are arranged in a single row that runs along the base of the buildings. These slabs are a pale grey colour, with darker patches where the stone is damp, and they have settled over time so that some are slightly higher than their neighbours, and the joints between them are filled with a dark gritty material that has been packed down by foot traffic. The edge of the sidewalk drops about 4 inches to the cobblestone street, and this drop is marked by a row of granite curbstones that are darker and rougher than the sidewalk slabs. The curbstones have iron rings set into them at intervals, and these rings are used for tethering horses, though most of them are empty now, and they sit flush against the stone with only a faint ring of rust around the opening to show where they are. The cobblestones themselves are roundish stones that were gathered from riverbeds or quarries long ago, and they range in colour from pale grey to dark brown to a reddish purple that appears only when the light hits them in a certain way. Each stone is perhaps 4 or 5 inches across, and they are set tightly together in a bed of sand and gravel so that only the rounded tops are visible above the surface. The pattern is not perfectly regular because the stones vary in size and shape, and they have been fitted together by hand with small stones filling the gaps between larger ones. The surface is uneven, and walking on it requires a certain attention to where you place your feet, because a stone might be slightly higher than its neighbours, or a gap might catch the toe of your shoe if you are not careful. The street is never truly empty, even in the quietest hours of the day, and there is always some small movement to observe if you stand at the window long enough. A pushcart might be parked against the curb, with its wooden wheels resting on the cobblestones, and its handles tilted up toward the sky. The cart is a simple wooden box mounted on 2 large wheels with a pair of long shafts that extend forward and a crossbar that the vendor holds when pushing or pulling. The wood of the cart is a weathered grey-brown, and it has been repaired many times with patches of newer wood that stand out as lighter rectangles against the darker original planks. The wheels are made of thick wooden segments fitted together with iron bands around the rims, and they turn slowly when a breeze catches the cart or when someone brushes against it in passing. The vendor who owns the cart might be standing nearby, and he might be arranging his goods on the flat surface of the cart bed. The goods vary from day to day and from cart to cart, but they are often simple things such as apples or potatoes or onions piled in small pyramids that catch the light and cast tiny shadows on the wooden surface. The apples are a dull red or a greenish yellow, and they have small blemishes and spots that are visible even from this height. The potatoes are brown and dusty, and they still have traces of soil clinging to their skins. The onions are pale gold and papery, and they rustle softly when the vendor moves them from one pile to another. The vendor himself wears a flat cap and a dark coat that has faded to a nondescript grey, and he moves slowly and deliberately as if he has all the time in the world to arrange his produce, Just so. Farther down the street, there is another cart, and this one is piled with used clothing that hangs from a wooden rack attached to the sides. The clothing is a jumble of colors that have all faded to similar shades of brown and gray and dull blue, so that from a distance the cart looks like a mound of autumn leaves that have been gathered and piled against the curb. A woman stands beside this cart, and she reaches up to touch a sleeve or a collar, and her hand moves slowly from one garment to the next as she considers each piece in turn. The vendor stands back with his arms folded, and he watches without speaking, and the transaction takes place in a slow, silent pantomime that you observe from above without hearing a single word. A horse-drawn wagon appears at the far end of the street, and it moves toward you at a walking pace that seems almost too slow to be real. The horse is a large brown animal with a long face and a patient expression, and its hooves make a steady clopping sound against the cobblestones that reaches your window as a soft, muffled rhythm. The horse wears a leather harness that is dark with age and sweat, and the brass fittings catch the light in small bright flashes as the animal moves. The wagon behind the horse is loaded with barrels or crates or sacks of something heavy, and the wooden bed creaks and groans with each bump in the uneven street. The driver sits on a high seat at the front, with the reins held loosely in one hand, and he stares straight ahead with an expression of calm indifference that suggests he has made this same journey many times before and will make it many times again. The wagon passes beneath your window, and you can see the top of the driver's hat and the broad back of the horse and the pattern of the cobblestones that appear between the wheels as the vehicle moves forward. The sound of the iron-rimmed wheels on the stone is a low rumbling that vibrates through the glass and into the air around you, and it fades slowly as the wagon continues down the street and disappears around a corner or into a side alley. The street returns to its previous quiet, and the only movement is the slow shifting of shadows as the sun moves across the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings. The shadows themselves are worth observing because they change the appearance of the street in ways that are subtle but continuous. In the early morning, the street is entirely in shadow, and the cobblestones are a uniform dark grey that shows no detail or texture. As the sun rises higher, it clears the rooftops on the opposite side of the street, and a bright line of light appears along the upper stories of the buildings and then descends slowly downward as the morning progresses. By mid-morning, the light has reached the street, and it falls in a sharp diagonal line that cuts across the cobblestones and the sidewalk and climbs partway up the wall of the building opposite. The line is not perfectly straight because the buildings are not perfectly aligned, and it jogs slightly where a cornice or a windowsill projects outward from the facade. The light side of the street is warm and golden, and the cobblestones show their full range of colors and textures, while the shadow side remains cool and gray and somewhat indistinct. The line between light and shadow moves very slowly, and you cannot see it change from moment to moment. But if you look away for a while and then look back, you will notice that the bright area has grown or shrunk or shifted to a new position. A pushcart that was entirely in shadow an hour ago might now be half in light, with one wheel glowing warmly and the other still dark and cool. The vendor standing beside it might step forward into the sun, and his coat will brighten and his face will be illuminated, and then he will step back into the shade and fade again into the general greyness of the street. The people who walk along the sidewalk below are small figures seen from this height, and they move with a variety of speeds and purposes that you can observe without understanding. Some walk quickly with their heads down and their hands in their pockets, and they disappear into doorways or around corners without any sound reaching your window. Others walk slowly, and they pause to look at the goods on a cart or to speak with someone they have met by chance. These conversations are silent pantomimes from your vantage point, and you see only the gestures and the turning of heads and the slow nodding that indicates agreement or understanding. A woman carries a basket on her arm, and the basket is covered with a cloth that flaps gently in the breeze that moves through the street canyon. A child walks beside her, holding onto her skirt with one small hand and taking 2 steps for every one of hers. A street sweeper appears from a cross street, pushing a wide broom made of bundled twigs that scrapes against the cobblestones with a sound that is too faint to hear from your window. He moves slowly and methodically, and he gathers a small pile of dust and debris and horse droppings and pushes it toward the gutter, where it will be collected later, or washed away by the next rain. The broom leaves faint parallel scratches on the surface of the cobblestones, and these scratches catch the light differently than the untouched stones, so that you can see the path he has taken as a faint trail of brightness across the darker background. He works his way down the street, and you watch him grow smaller and smaller until he is just another dark shape, moving among the other dark shapes at the far end of the block. The sounds of the street are muted by the glass and by the height, and they reach you as a blended murmur that has no distinct parts. The clop of hooves and the rumble of wheels and the calls of vendors and the murmur of voices all combine into a single low sound that rises and falls in volume but never quite stops. This sound is the background against which all the other sounds of the building are heard, and it is so constant that you stop noticing it after a while unless something changes. A sudden shout or the crack of a whip will cut through the murmur and reach your ears as a distinct sound that draws your attention to the window and then fades back into the general hum. A dog barking somewhere below will echo off the brick walls and bounce up the air shaft and reach you as a series of sharp notes that repeat and then stop. The street has a particular smell that drifts up to the window when the breeze is right, and it is a complex mixture of many things. There is the smell of horse manure and hay that rises from the stables and the passing wagons, and there is the smell of cooking food from the basement kitchens and the street vendors who sell hot potatoes or roasted chestnuts from small braziers. There is the smell of coal smoke that hangs in the air like a thin grey veil, and the smell of damp stone and old brick that rises from the buildings themselves. These smells are not strong at this height, but they are present as faint suggestions that come and go with the shifting air currents, and they add another layer to the experience of standing at the window and looking down. The light changes again as the afternoon wears on, and the sun moves behind the buildings on your side of the street. The street falls into shadow once more, and the cobblestones return to their uniform grey, and the colours of the carts and the clothing and the goods all fade to similar shades of brown and black. The windows on the opposite building catch the last of the sunlight, and they glow for a while like squares of pale gold set into the dark brick facade. Then the sun drops below the rooftops altogether, and the windows go dark, and the street is lit only by the diffuse grey light of the sky above. The gas lamps that line the street are lit one by one as the evening deepens, and you can see the lamplighter making his rounds with a long pole that has a small flame at its tip. He moves from lamp to lamp, and he reaches up with the pole and touches the flame to the gas jet, and each lamp blooms into a small globe of yellow light that pushes back the darkness for a few feet in every direction. The pools of light overlap slightly so that the street is not entirely dark, but rather it is a patchwork of brightness and shadow that shifts as the flames flicker in the evening breeze. The carts are gone now, and the vendors have gone home, and the street is quiet except for the occasional passer-by, who walks quickly through the pools of light and disappears into the shadows between. The window at the end of the hallway grows cold as the night comes on, and you can feel the chill radiating from the glass when you stand close. The view outside becomes harder to see because the darkness outside turns the glass into a faint mirror that reflects the dim light of the hallway behind you. You can see your own shape in the glass, a dark silhouette against the yellow glow of the gas jet down the hall and beyond your reflection. The street is a deep blue-grey that shows only the faintest outlines of the buildings opposite. The gas lamps are small points of warm light that waver and dance, and they are the only sign that the street is still there, and that the world beyond the window continues on in its slow and quiet way. You turn away from the window and walk back down the hallway toward your own door, and the street behind you remains as it was, a narrow canyon of brick and stone and cobblestones that has looked much the same for many years and will look much the same for many years to come. The carts will return in the morning, and the horses will walk their slow routes, and the people will go about their business, and the light will move across the stones in its ancient daily rhythm. The window will be there waiting, and the view will be the same and different all at once, and you can return to it whenever you wish to stand and look out at the quiet world below. The air shaft is a narrow vertical space that runs from the ground to the open sky, and it is bordered on all sides by the brick walls of the surrounding tenement buildings. If you were to open the window in the small room and lean out slightly, you would see the shaft stretching upward and downward into dimness, with the walls so close that you could almost touch the opposite side with your outstretched hand. The shaft is perhaps 6 feet wide and 20 feet long, and it was designed to provide a minimum of light and ventilation to the interior rooms that face it. But the light that reaches the bottom is faint and grey, and the air that moves through the shaft is slow and heavy, and it carries with it a collection of sounds that travel up and down the brick walls in strange and unpredictable ways. The sounds that live in the airshaft are not the sounds of the street, which are distant and muffled and blend into a single low hum by the time they reach this interior space. The sounds of the airshaft are closer and more intimate, and they come from the lives being lived in the rooms that open onto this narrow vertical canyon. Every window that faces the shaft is a small opening through which sound escapes, and these sounds mingle together in the central space, creating a layered acoustic environment that is never completely silent and never completely loud, but exists in a middle state of constant quiet murmur. If you stand at the window and listen carefully, you will begin to separate the layers of sound one from another, though this takes time and patience because the sounds overlap and blend and echo in ways that make it difficult to trace any single sound back to its source. The closest sounds are the ones that come from the rooms directly above or below or across from your own window, and these are the most distinct and recognizable. A chair being pushed back from a table in the room above will produce a short scraping sound that travels down the shaft and reaches your ears with a slight delay, as if the sound itself is moving slowly through the heavy air. The scrape is followed by a soft thump as the chair legs settle into a new position on the wooden floor, and then there is silence again, except for the constant background hum. The sound of a door closing somewhere below is a more complex thing, because it begins with the sharp click of the latch engaging, and then expands into a low thud that echoes off the parallel brick walls. This thud travels upward and downward at the same time, and it bounces back and forth between the walls so that you hear not one sound but a series of diminishing repetitions that grow softer and more blurred with each reflection. The original sound came from a specific door on a specific floor, but by the time it reaches your window, it has become a generalized sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A soft, percussive note that hangs in the air for a moment and then fades into the background murmur. Water running through pipes is another common sound in the airshaft, and it has a particular quality that sets it apart from the other sounds. The pipes themselves are hidden inside the walls, but their presence is revealed whenever someone in the building opens a tap or flushes a basin. The sound begins as a distant gurgling that seems to come from deep within the brickwork, and it grows louder and clearer as the water moves through the vertical pipes that run up the corners of the shaft. The gurgling is irregular, and it rises and falls in pitch as the water encounters bends and valves and changes in pressure. Sometimes the sound stops abruptly with a soft clunk as a valve closes, and sometimes it fades slowly away, leaving only the memory of its presence. The sound of a voice speaking in a room across the shaft is a strange and disembodied thing because the words themselves are lost in the transmission, and only the rhythm and tone of the voice survive. You can tell that someone is speaking because you hear the rise and fall of speech patterns and the occasional pause where a response would come, but you cannot make out a single word. The voice is muffled and softened by the distance and by the glass of the closed windows, and it arrives at your ears as a kind of music that conveys emotion without meaning. A low murmur might indicate a calm conversation, while a sharper rising tone might suggest a question or an exclamation, but the content remains a mystery. There are sounds that come from the very bottom of the air shaft, where the ground is covered with flagstones and a thin layer of debris that has fallen from the windows above over many years. These sounds are the faintest of all because they must travel the greatest distance to reach your window, and they are filtered through layers of heavy air and reflected off countless brick surfaces. A cat moving through the shaft in search of mice will make a soft padding sound that is barely audible, a whisper of movement that you might mistake for the wind if you were not listening carefully. The clink of a bottle being set down or the rustle of paper being moved drifts up from the bottom as a ghost of a sound that is present and then gone before you can be certain you heard it at all. The airshaft has its own weather that is different from the weather in the street, and this weather produces its own set of sounds. When rain falls on the city, the drops that find their way into the shaft make a particular sound as they strike the flagstones at the bottom and the window sills and the metal flashing around the roof edges. The sound of rain in the shaft is softer and more diffuse than rain in the open street because the drops are broken up by the narrow walls and they fall in a scattered pattern rather than a steady downpour. Each drop makes a small ticking sound when it hits a hard surface, and these ticks overlap and blend into a soft, continuous patter that rises and falls with the intensity of the rain. The brick walls darken with moisture, and the sound of water trickling down the mortar joints adds a wet, whispering note to the background. Wind in the air shaft is a different thing from wind in the open street, because the narrow walls channel and compress the moving air so that it accelerates and changes direction in unpredictable ways. A gentle breeze at street level might become a strong gust at the level of your window, and this gust will produce a low moaning sound as it passes over the sharp edges of the brickwork and the window frames. The moan rises and falls in pitch, and it is accompanied by the rattling of loose window sashes and the creaking of old wood that flexes under the pressure. When the wind dies down, the shaft falls silent again, and the only sound is the faint sigh of air moving through the cracks and gaps that are always present in an old building. The sounds of the air shaft follow a daily rhythm that is tied to the routines of the people who live in the surrounding rooms. In the early morning, before the sun has reached the shaft, there is a period of relative quiet, broken only by the occasional sound of someone rising and moving about in the darkness. The first sounds of the day are often the creak of bed frames and the soft pad of bare feet on wooden floors and the clink of a stove door being opened for the morning fire. These sounds are scattered and irregular, and they come from different directions at different times, so that the overall effect is one of a building slowly waking and stretching and preparing for the day ahead. As the morning progresses, the sounds multiply and overlap, and the air shaft becomes a busy acoustic space filled with the evidence of many lives being lived in close proximity. The sound of water being poured from a bucket into a basin creates a liquid splashing note that is bright and clear, and it is followed by the softer sound of washing and the drip of water falling back into the basin. The sound of a knife chopping vegetables on a wooden board produces a rapid series of soft thuds that travel across the shaft and mingle with the other kitchen sounds from other rooms. The sizzle of food in a hot pan is a brief sharp sound that rises and then fades as the pan is removed from the heat. The middle of the day brings a lull in the sounds of the air shaft, because many of the people who live in the building are out in the city, working or running errands, or simply sitting quietly in their rooms. During these hours, the background hum of the city becomes more noticeable because there are fewer close sounds to mask it. The distant rumble of wagons, and the faint calls of street vendors, and the low vibration of the building itself all become clearer and more present during the midday quiet. A single sound during these hours, such as a door closing or a child crying briefly, will stand out sharply against the quiet background and then fade, leaving the hum to fill the space once more. The late afternoon and early evening bring a return of activity, and the air shaft fills again with the sounds of people returning home and preparing meals and settling into their evening routines. The sound of footsteps on stairs is transmitted through the walls and into the shaft as a series of soft thuds that ascend and descend in regular patterns. Voices rise and fall in conversation, and laughter occasionally breaks through the general murmur, a bright, sharp sound that cuts across the lower tones and then subsides. The clatter of dishes, and the scrape of chairs, and the hiss of steam from a boiling pot all blend together into a warm acoustic fabric that fills the shaft and spills through the open windows into the rooms beyond. As the evening deepens, the sounds gradually diminish, and the air shaft settles into a different kind of quiet that is deeper and more sustained than the midday lull. The voices fade first, and then the kitchen sounds, and then the footsteps on the stairs become less frequent until they stop altogether. The building is not completely silent, because there is always the hum of the city and the small sounds of the building itself, the ticking of cooling wood and the sigh of air moving through the cracks. But the close human sounds that give the shaft its character during the day are gone, and the space becomes a hollow vertical tunnel that carries only the faintest echoes of the life that surrounds it. The night sounds of the air shaft are the most subtle, and they require the most attention to perceive. A distant cough from a room several floors away will travel down the shaft as a soft explosion of sound that is muffled and brief. The creak of a floorboard under a late-night footstep will reach your window as a single quiet note that hangs in the air for a moment and then dissolves. The low murmur of a voice speaking softly in the darkness will drift across the shaft like a thread of smoke that twists and fades before you can grasp its shape. These sounds are so faint that you might imagine some of them, and the line between hearing and imagining becomes blurred in the deep quiet of the night. The air shaft has a particular acoustic quality that comes from its shape and its materials, and this quality colors every sound that passes through it. The parallel brick walls create a natural echo chamber that sustains certain frequencies and suppresses others, so that sounds are transformed in subtle ways during their journey from source to listener. A high-pitched sound like the cry of a baby will bounce back and forth between the walls and arrive at your window as a series of overlapping repetitions that blur the original note into a soft, sustained tone. A low-pitched sound like the rumble of a cart in the street will be absorbed by the porous brick and will reach you as a faint vibration that you feel in your chest more than you hear with your ears. The brick walls themselves contribute to the sound of the air shaft in ways that are not immediately obvious. The mortar between the bricks is old and crumbling in places, and small gaps have opened up where the bricks have shifted over time. These gaps allow sound to travel between the shaft and the interior rooms in both directions, so that a conversation in a room 3 floors below might leak into the shaft and travel upward to your window as a faint, unintelligible murmur. The walls also absorb moisture from the air, and this moisture changes the acoustic properties of the brick so that sounds are slightly different on damp days than on dry ones. A door closing on a humid afternoon will produce a softer, more muffled thud, while the same door on a dry, cold day will create a sharper, brighter sound that echoes more distinctly. The window glass adds another layer of transformation to the sounds that enter the room from the air shaft. The glass is old and wavy, and it vibrates in response to certain frequencies so that loud sounds cause the panes to rattle softly in their wooden frames. This rattling adds a faint buzzing quality to the sound that is most noticeable, with low continuous noises like the rumble of a distant wagon or the hum of machinery somewhere in the city. The glass also reflects some sounds back into the shaft, while allowing others to pass through, so that what you hear inside the room is a filtered and modified version of the original sound. There are moments when the airshaft falls into an almost perfect silence that is rare and remarkable in a building so full of people. These moments usually come in the deepest part of the night, when the city itself has grown quiet and the building has settled into its deepest rest. During these moments, you can hear the sound of your own breathing and the faint rush of blood in your ears, and the tiny creaks and ticks of the room around you. The silence is not truly empty because there is always something to hear if you listen closely enough, but it is as close to silence as this place ever comes. Then a distant sound will break the spell, a dog barking far away, or the clank of a pipe in the wall, or the soft cry of a baby in a room across the shaft. And the silence will retreat, and the usual quiet murmur will return. The airshaft is a space that connects all the rooms that face it into a single acoustic community, where sounds are shared and transformed and passed along from one window to the next. A lullaby sung in a room on the 4th floor will drift down the shaft and enter the windows of the floors below, as a soft melody stripped of its words. The sound of a family eating their evening meal together will travel across the shaft as a pleasant clatter of dishes and murmur of voices that carries no specific information, but conveys a general sense of warmth and presence. The sounds of argument or distress travel as well, and they are absorbed into the general acoustic fabric, losing their sharp edges and becoming just another thread in the complex tapestry of sound. This is the sound of the airshaft, and it is always present whether you are listening or not, a constant companion to the quiet hours spent in the small room. The sounds will continue through the night and into the next day and the day after that, following the rhythms of the building and the people who live within its walls. The shaft will carry the sounds upward and downward, and the brick walls will echo and transform them, and the old glass will vibrate in sympathy, and the whole complex system will continue its slow, quiet work of transmitting the evidence of life from one part of the building to another. And if you stand at the window and close your eyes, you can hear it all at once, the layered murmuring voice of the tenement speaking softly to itself in the grey light of the airshaft. The oil lamp sits on the small wooden table near the window, where the light is best during the day, but where the darkness comes earliest in the evening. The lamp is a simple object, made of brass and glass, and it has been in use for many years, so that every part of it shows the marks of age and handling. The base is a round brass reservoir that holds the oil, and it is about 6 inches across and 4 inches high, with a slightly domed bottom that allows it to sit steadily on the tabletop. The brass is tarnished over time to a deep brownish gold color that glows warmly even when the lamp is not lit. There are faint scratches on the surface that form a pattern of fine lines circling the base, and these scratches catch the light in different ways depending on the angle from which you view them. The burner assembly screws into the top of the reservoir and it consists of several small brass parts that fit together with precision. There is a collar that threads onto the reservoir opening, and this collar holds the wick tube, which is a narrow brass cylinder that extends down into the oil and up through the center of the burner. The wick itself is a flat cotton ribbon that passes through the wick tube and emerges at the top, where it can be adjusted up or down by means of a small toothed wheel on the side of the burner. The wheel is about the size of a thumbnail, and it has tiny ridges that provide grip for your fingertip when you turn it. Turning the wheel raises or lowers the wick by a fraction of an inch, and this controls the size and brightness of the flame. Above the burner sits the glass chimney, which is a tall clear cylinder that protects the flame from drafts and helps to create the proper airflow for clean burning. The chimney is about 8 inches tall, and it flares out slightly at the bottom, where it fits into a set of brass prongs that hold it in place. The glass is thin and delicate, and it has a faint bluish or greenish tint that is only visible when you look through the edge of the glass rather than through its face. There is a small chip in the bottom rim of the chimney, where it was once set down too hard on the table, and this chip has been smoothed by handling over the years so that it is no longer sharp to the touch. The inside of the chimney is coated with a fine film of soot that builds up slowly over many hours of burning, and this film softens the light that passes through it, giving it a warm golden quality. The oil that fills the reservoir is a clear liquid with a pale yellow color and a distinctive smell that is sharp and slightly sweet at the same time. The oil is stored in a tin can that sits on the floor beside the table, and the can has a small spout that makes pouring easier, though a few drops always escape and run down the side, leaving a sticky residue that collects dust and turns dark over time. The smell of the oil is strongest when you are filling the lamp, and it fills the room for a few minutes before fading into the background, where it remains as a faint presence that you notice only when you first enter the room after being away. The oil has a particular weight and viscosity that you can feel when you pour it, because it flows more slowly than water, and it makes a soft glugging sound as it leaves the can and enters the brass reservoir. The evening routine with the lamp begins when the light from the window has faded to a deep grey, and the room has grown dim enough that the corners have disappeared into shadow and the outlines of the furniture have become soft and indistinct. You take the lamp from the table and carry it carefully to the center of the room, where you can work on it with enough space to avoid knocking anything over. The lamp is heavy because the reservoir is still partly full from the night before, and you can feel the weight of the oil shifting slightly as you move. You set the lamp down on the floor, and you kneel beside it so that you are at eye level with the burner and the chimney. The first step is to remove the glass chimney, and this must be done with care, because the glass is hot if the lamp has been used recently, though in the evening it is usually cool to the touch. You grip the chimney near the bottom where it flares out, and you lift it straight up with a gentle twisting motion that frees it from the brass prongs. The chimney comes free with a soft scraping sound as the glass slides against the metal, and you set it aside on a folded cloth where it will not roll or tip over. The inside of the chimney is slightly hazy from the previous night's burning, and you can see the faint brownish film that has settled on the glass. The next step is to check the level of the oil in the reservoir, and to add more if it is needed. You unscrew the burner assembly from the reservoir by turning it counterclockwise, and it comes free with a slight resistance as the brass threads release their grip. The reservoir opening is a round hole about an inch across, and you can see the oil inside glimmering faintly in the dim light. The oil level is perhaps halfway down, and you decide to fill it within an inch of the top, because a full reservoir will burn through the night without needing to be refilled. You take the oil can from the floor and you remove the small cap from the spout, and you pour the oil slowly into the reservoir, watching the level rise with each glug from the can. The oil makes a soft liquid sound as it flows, and it smells strongly of its sharp, sweet scent which fills the air around you. When the reservoir is full, you set the can aside and you screw the burner assembly back into place, turning it clockwise until it is snug but not overly tight. The wick must be trimmed before the lamp can be lit, because a wick that has been burned before will have a charred crust on its upper edge that prevents the oil from flowing freely and causes the flame to smoke and flicker. You raise the wick by turning the small brass wheel until about half an inch of the charred portion is visible above the wick tube. The wick is stiff and blackened at the tip, and it has a crusty texture that flakes away when you touch it. You take a small pair of scissors from the table and you carefully trim away the charred portion, cutting straight across the wick, so that the fresh cotton fibers are exposed in a clean, even line. The charred bits fall onto the floor onto your hand, and they are light and fragile, and they crumble into a fine black dust that stains your fingertips. The freshly trimmed wick is soft and white, and it has a slightly fuzzy texture where the individual cotton fibers have been cut. After trimming the wick, you lower it again by turning the wheel in the opposite direction until only a small amount of the fresh cotton is visible above the wick tube, perhaps 1/8 of an inch. This is the correct height for lighting, because a wick that is too high will produce a large smoky flame that consumes oil too quickly and blackens the chimney, while a wick that is too low will produce a small weak flame that gives little light. The adjustment is made by feel and by experience, and you have done it so many times that your fingers know the right position without conscious thought. Before lighting the lamp, you must clean the chimney if it has become too smoky from previous use. You take a soft cloth and you reach inside the chimney, wiping the interior surface with a gentle circular motion that removes the thin film of soot. The cloth comes away with a grayish-black smudge that transfers to your fingers, and you set the cloth aside to be washed later. The clean chimney is clearer and brighter, and it will allow more light to pass through, though a faint haze always remains because the glass is old and has been etched by years of use. You replace the chimney on the burner, fitting it carefully over the wick tube and pressing it down until the flared bottom seats securely in the brass prongs. The chimney stands straight and tall, and it wobbles slightly if you touch it, because the fit is not perfectly tight, and there is a small amount of play in the prongs. This is normal, and it does not affect the function of the lamp. Now you are ready to light the lamp, and you take a match from the small tin box that sits on the mantel or on the table beside the lamp. The match is a thin wooden splinter with a red head, and you strike it against the rough strip on the side of the box with a quick downward motion. The match flares with a soft hiss and a bright yellow flame that wavers in the air currents of the room. You bring the flame to the exposed tip of the wick and you touch it gently to the cotton fibers. The wick catches immediately, and a small blue and yellow flame springs up from the wick tube. At first the flame is small, and it flickers and dances as the oil begins to flow up through the cotton fibers. You watch the flame for a moment to be sure that it is burning steadily, and then you adjust the wick height slightly by turning the brass wheel until the flame is the right size. The proper flame is about 1/2 inch high, and it has a distinct shape that you have come to know well. The base of the flame is blue and nearly transparent, and this is where the oil vaporizes and mixes with the air. Above the blue zone, the flame becomes yellow and bright, and it tapers to a soft rounded point that wavers slightly, but does not smoke. The yellow portion of the flame is the part that produces light, and it glows with a warm golden color that is different from the harsh white light of gas, or the cold blue light of a gas, or the cold blue light of electricity. The flame makes a soft sound as it burns, a gentle hissing or sighing that is barely audible unless you lean close and listen carefully. This sound is the sound of the oil being consumed and the air being drawn up through the burner, and is a constant companion to the evening hours. You place the lamp back on the table near the window, and you position it so that the light falls where it will be most useful for the evening's activities. The lamp casts a warm circle of light that extends perhaps 3 or 4 feet in every direction, and beyond this circle the room falls away into deep shadow. The light is not bright enough to read by unless you sit very close to the lamp, but it is enough to move about the room and to see the outlines of the furniture and the walls. The quality of the light is soft and forgiving, and it makes the room feel smaller and more intimate than it does during the day when the grey light from the window reveals every crack and stain. The shadows that the lamp casts are different from the shadows of daylight because they are softer at the edges, and they move and shift as the flame flickers in response to the slightest air currents. The shadow of the lamp itself falls on the wall behind it as a tall dark shape that is recognizable as a lamp only because you know what it is. The shadow of your own hand moves across the wall when you reach for something on the table, and it is larger than your real hand and slightly distorted. These shadows are a constant presence in the lamplit room, and they give the space a sense of depth and texture that is missing in the flat grey light of day. The smell of the burning lamp is different from the smell of the cold oil, and it is a smell that you associate with evening and with the slow winding down of the day. The hot brass of the burner gives off a faint metallic scent that mingles with the smell of the burning oil, which is sharper and more acrid than the cold oil. There is also the smell of the hot glass chimney, which has a clean, hot smell like stones warmed by the sun. These smells combine into a single complex presence that fills the room and lingers in the air long after the lamp has been extinguished. The lamp requires occasional attention throughout the evening to keep it burning properly. You must check the flame from time to time to be sure that it has not grown too high and begun to smoke, because a smoking flame will deposit soot on the chimney and fill the room with an unpleasant acrid smell. If the flame is smoking, you can see a thin, dark wisp rising from the tip, and you must turn the wick down slightly until the smoke disappears and the flame returns to its clean yellow shape. You must also watch for signs that the wick needs to be trimmed again, because a wick that has been burning for several hours will develop a small crust of carbon on its edge that causes the flame to flicker and dim. When this happens, you must extinguish the lamp and let it cool for a few minutes before removing the chimney and trimming the wick once more. The light from the lamp changes the appearance of everything in the room, and it makes the familiar objects seem slightly different than they do in daylight. The grain of the wooden floorboards becomes more pronounced, and the dark lines of the grain stand out against the paler wood like rivers on a map. The plaster walls take on a warm golden tone that softens the cracks and stains and makes the room feel more comfortable and lived in. The window glass becomes a dark mirror that reflects the lamp flame and your own face and the dim shapes of the room behind you. You cannot see out into the air shaft at all when the lamp is lit, because the darkness outside is complete and the glass only shows you what is inside. The lamp burns steadily through the evening, and you go about your quiet activities in its warm circle of light. You might sit in the chair near the table and take up the sewing from the basket, working by the lamplight with the fabric held close to the flame, so that you can see the stitches clearly. The light is not as good as daylight and your eyes grow tired more quickly, but the work is simple and repetitive, and your fingers know what to do without much help from your eyes. The needle flashes in the lamplight, and the thread pulls through the fabric with a soft whisper, and the lamp hisses gently on the table beside you. You might read for a while if you have a book or a newspaper, and you hold the pages close to the lamp and tilt them so that the light falls evenly across the text. The words are small and the light is dim, and you must move the page slowly as you read to keep the illuminated spots centered on the line you are reading. This slow movement becomes a rhythm that matches the flicker of the flame and the soft sound of the lamp and the quiet of the room around you. After a while, your eyes grow heavy, and you set the book aside and simply sit in the warm glow, watching the flame dance and listening to the sounds of the building settling into the night. The lamp is a small sun in the dark room, and it pushes back the shadows that gather in the corners and under the furniture. The light does not reach everywhere, and there are always dark spaces where the glow fades into blackness, but the circle of warmth and visibility is enough to make the room feel safe and enclosed. The darkness beyond the circle is not threatening but simply unknown, and it holds the familiar shapes of chairs and tables and the bed in the corner that you cannot see but know are there. As the evening wears on toward night, you prepare the lamp for the hours of darkness ahead. You check the oil level once more by tilting the lamp slightly and watching the liquid move inside the reservoir. If the level is low, you add more oil, being careful not to overfill, because the oil expands slightly as it warms and a too full reservoir can overflow and create a mess. You trim the wick one final time, raising it carefully and cutting away the charred crust with the small scissors and then lowering it back to the proper height. The freshly trimmed wick will burn cleanly through the night, and you will not need to attend to it again until morning. You may choose to leave the lamp burning at a low setting while you sleep, so that the room is not completely dark, and so that you can see if you need to rise during the night. To do this, you turn the wick down until the flame is very small, just a tiny blue and yellow teardrop that gives off a faint glow and casts almost no shadows. The small flame makes a softer sound than the full flame, a gentle whisper that is barely audible even in the quiet of the night. The lamp will burn for many hours at this low setting, and the oil will be consumed very slowly. You place the lamp on the floor near the bed where it is safe from being knocked over and where its faint light will be visible if you open your eyes in the darkness. The glow is just enough to make out the shape of the door and the window and the outline of the furniture so that you can move about the room without stumbling if you need to. The light does not disturb your sleep, but rather it provides a small anchor of warmth and visibility in the deep quiet of the night. Before you lie down, you take one last look at the lamp, and you see the tiny flame burning steadily inside the glass chimney. The flame wavers slightly with each breath of air that moves through the room, but it never goes out, and it continues its slow consumption of the oil and the wick. The lamp has been lit in this room on countless evenings before this one, and it will be lit on countless evenings to come, and each lighting is the same ritual performed with the same careful motions and the same quiet attention. The oil flows up through the cotton fibers, and the flame burns at the tip, and the light spreads out into the darkness, and the room is filled with a warm golden glow that softens the edges of everything it touches. You lie down and you close your eyes, and the lamplight filters through your eyelids as a soft orange presence that fades slowly as you drift towards sleep. The lamp burns on through the night, a small steady flame in a glass chimney on a brass base on the wooden floor of a small room in a brick building in the heart of the city. The sounds of the night are soft and distant, and the lamp hisses gently to itself, and the oil level drops imperceptibly with each passing hour. In the morning you will rise, and you will extinguish the lamp by turning the wick down until the flame disappears with a soft puff of smoke that smells of burnt cotton and oil. You will lift the chimney, and you will see the fresh crust of carbon on the wick, and you will know that the evening will come again, and the ritual will begin anew, with the filling and the trimming and the lighting of the lamp. The weight of laundry is a thing that accumulates slowly over the days and then must be addressed all at once in a concentrated period of effort that fills the small room with the smells of soap and damp fabric and the sounds of water and scrubbing and the soft drip of moisture falling back into the basin. The soiled linens and garments have been collecting in a cloth bag that hangs from a hook on the back of the door, and the bag has grown fuller and heavier as the week has passed. The bag is made of coarse, unbleached cotton, and it has a drawstring at the top that pulls tight to keep the contents contained. The fabric of the bag is stained in places where damp items were placed inside before they were fully dry, and these stains have faint greyish rings that have set into the fibers and will never wash out completely. The morning that you choose for the washing is a morning when the air in the room feels slightly less damp than usual, and when the small stove has been burning long enough to take the chill off the space. The warmth from the stove will help the washed items to dry, and this is an important consideration because drying must happen indoors and the process is slow and requires patience. You take the cloth bag down from the hook and you carry it to the center of the room where you have placed the large wooden basin that you use for washing. The basin is made of pine staves bound with metal hoops, much like the water bucket, but larger and wider and shallower. It is perhaps 2 feet across and 8 inches deep, and it sits on the floorboards with a folded piece of old cloth beneath it to catch any splashes that might escape over the rim. The water for the washing has been carried up from the pump in the courtyard earlier in the morning, and it sits in the bucket in the corner, waiting to be used. The water is cold and clear, and it has the faint metallic smell that comes from the iron pipes and the deep underground source. You will need both cold water and hot water for the washing, and so you have set a small pot of water on the stove to heat while you prepare the other things. The pot is made of enameled metal with a dark blue speckled surface, and it has a small chip on the rim where the white underlayer shows through. The water in the pot begins to make a soft sound as it warms, a low murmur that grows into a gentle simmer and then into a quiet rolling boil that sends small bubbles rising to the surface. You gather the other supplies that you will need for the washing and you arrange them around the basin so that they will be within easy reach. There is a bar of lye soap that sits in a small dish near the stove where it stays dry between uses. The soap is a pale greyish-brown color, and it has a harsh, clean smell that is sharp and alkaline, and it makes your nose tingle slightly when you hold it close. The surface of the soap is rough and grainy, and it is worn down unevenly from previous use, so that it fits comfortably into the curve of your palm. There is a small washboard made of corrugated metal set into a wooden frame, and this stands against the wall near the basin. The metal surface is divided into a series of parallel ridges that run horizontally across the board, and these ridges are slightly worn and shiny from the friction of countless garments being scrubbed against them. The first step is to sort through the contents of the cloth bag and to separate the items into piles according to their fabric and their degree of soiling. You untie the drawstring and you reach into the bag and you pull out each piece one by one, laying it on the floor beside you. There are simple undergarments made of unbleached cotton that have yellowed slightly with age and washing. There are several shirts of coarse linen that show dark rings around the collars and cuffs where skin oils have accumulated. There are stockings made of wool that are stiff with dried sweat, And there are kitchen cloths that are stained with traces of food and grease. Each piece has its own particular smell that rises from the fabric as you handle it, a smell that is a mixture of the person who wore it, and the room where it was kept, and the long, slow accumulation of daily life. You fill the basin partway with cold water from the bucket, and you add a measure of hot water from the pot on the stove so that the temperature is warm but not hot enough to scald your hands. The water swirls as you pour, and it takes on a slightly cloudy appearance as the hot and cold mix together. You test the temperature with your fingertips, and it is comfortable, a gentle warmth that will open the fibers of the fabric and help the soap to work. The smell of the water is clean and neutral, and it fills the basin with a clear surface that reflects the light from the window in a soft, wavering patch. The washing begins with the lightest soiled items first, because the water is cleanest at the start, and it will become progressively dirtier as you work through the piles. You take one of the cotton undergarments, and you submerge it in the warm water, pressing it down with your hands until it is fully saturated. The fabric darkens as it absorbs the water, and it becomes heavier and more pliable, and the air bubbles trapped in the weave escape in a series of small silvery globules that rise to the surface and pop silently. You lift the garment from the water and you hold it dripping over the basin while you take the bar of soap in your other hand. You rub the soap against the fabric, working it into the areas that need the most attention, the underarms and the center seams, and any spots that show visible soiling. The soap makes a soft, slick sound as it moves against a wet cloth, and it leaves behind a thin white film that begins to foam slightly as you work it with your fingers. The washboard comes into use for the heavier items and for the places where simple rubbing with soap is not enough to remove the accumulated grime. You position the washboard so that it leans against the inside of the basin, with its lower edge resting on the bottom and its upper edge protruding above the water. You take a soapy garment and you press it against the corrugated metal surface, and you rub it up and down with a firm, steady motion. The ridges of the washboard create friction against the fabric, and this friction loosens the dirt and works the soap deep into the fibers. The sound of the washing is a rhythmic scrubbing noise that fills the room, a soft shushing sound that repeats with each downward stroke and a lighter sound on the upward return. The fabric makes a different sound depending on its weight and weave, and the coarse linen shirts produce a rougher sound than the soft cotton undergarments. The water in the basin begins to change as you work, and it takes on a grayish-brown color that deepens with each item you wash. The soap creates a thin foam on the surface that is mostly white, but tinged with the color of the dirt it has lifted from the fabric. Small particles of lint and dust float on the surface and cling to the sides of the basin, leaving a faint ring at the waterline that will need to be wiped away later. The smell of the washing water is a combination of the clean, sharp scent of the lye soap and the fainter, earthy smell of the dirt being released from the fabric, and these smells mingle together into a single presence that fills the room and clings to your hands and your clothing. When each item has been scrubbed and soaked to your satisfaction, you must rinse it to remove the soap and the loosened dirt. You empty the dirty water from the basin by carrying it carefully to the window and pouring it out into the air shaft, where it falls in a grey sheet that breaks apart into drops before it reaches the bottom. The sound of the water hitting the flagstones far below is a soft, distant splash that echoes up the shaft and then fades. You refill the basin with clean, cold water from the bucket, and you submerge the washed items one by one, squeezing them gently to release the soap that clings to the fibers. The rinse water becomes cloudy with soap, and you may need to change it once or twice for the larger loads until the water runs mostly clear and the fabric feels clean and soft against your fingers. The wringing out of each piece is the part of the process that requires the most strength, and it leaves your hands and forearms tired by the end. You take a wet garment and you fold it lengthwise so that it forms a long, narrow bundle, and you grip one end in each hand. Then you twist your hands in opposite directions so that the fabric tightens and compresses, and the water is forced out in a steady stream that falls back into the basin. The sound of the wringing is a wet, twisting sound accompanied by the patter of water droplets striking the wooden bottom of the basin. You twist as hard as you can, and you feel the resistance of the fabric and the slight burn in your wrists, and the water flows out and then slows to a drip, and then stops altogether. The run garment is still damp, but it is no longer dripping, and it has a cool, heavy feel that will slowly lighten as it dries. The drying process transforms the small room into a temporary landscape of hanging fabric that changes the way the light moves through the space and alters the acoustics and fills the air with the clean smell of wet cotton and linen and wool. You have strung a length of thin rope across one corner of the room from a nail in the wall near the window to another nail near the door. The rope is made of twisted hemp, and it has a rough, fibrous texture that grips the fabric and prevents it from sliding. You drape the smaller items over this rope, arranging them so that they hang without touching each other, because fabric that touches will dry more slowly in the area of contact. The undergarments and stockings hang in a row like pale flags, and they drip occasionally, sending a single drop of water down to the floorboards, where it lands with a soft plink and spreads into a small dark circle that fades as it evaporates. The larger items, such as the shirts and the kitchen cloths, are draped over the backs of chairs or spread across the tabletop, or hung from additional hooks that you have placed around the room for this purpose. A linen shirt hangs from the back of the wooden chair, with its sleeves dangling down toward the floor, and its collar stretched slightly out of shape by the weight of the water. The fabric is several shades darker than it will be when it is dry, and it has a translucent quality where the light from the window passes through it, revealing the grid of the weave and the small irregularities in the spinning of the thread. The wet fabric clings to the wood of the chair, and it leaves a damp patch on the seat and on the backrest that will take hours to dry completely. The kitchen cloths are spread flash on the tabletop, where they lie in damp rectangles that are darker at the edges where the water collects. You smooth them with your palms to remove the worst of the wrinkles, because wrinkles that dry into the fabric will be difficult to remove later without ironing. The cloths are thin, and they will dry quickly compared to the heavier garments, and you can already see the edges beginning to lighten as the water evaporates from the exposed fibers. The table beneath the cloths is protected by the oilcloth covering, but some moisture seeps through anyway, and you can feel the slight cool dampness if you press your hand against the cloth and the wood beneath. The room now has a particular smell that is the smell of clean laundry drying in an enclosed space. It is a soft smell with a slight sharpness from the residual lye soap, and it has a cool quality that makes the air feel fresher than it did before the washing began. The smell will linger for the rest of the day and into the evening, and it will be joined by the fainter smell of the damp fabric releasing its moisture into the air. This moisture increases the humidity in the room by a small but noticeable amount, and you can feel it on your skin as a slight tackiness, and you can see it on the window glass where a thin film of condensation forms on the inside surface. The condensation is not enough to run down the glass in drops, but it creates a soft haze that blurs the view of the air shaft and makes the light coming through the window even more diffuse and gentle. The drying process is slow, and it cannot be rushed because there is no wind in the room, and the only air movement comes from the small drafts that slip under the door and around the window frame. The fabric releases its moisture gradually, and the water molecules drift into the air and then slowly find their way out through the same cracks and gaps that let the drafts in. You can observe the progress of the drying by watching the color of the fabric change from dark to light as the moisture content decreases. The edges dry first because they are exposed on all sides, and you can see a pale border forming around the darker center of each hanging piece. This border widens slowly over the hours, and the dark, damp center shrinks until it is just a small patch, and then a faint shadow, and then it is gone altogether. The sound of the drying laundry is a quiet sound that you notice only when the room is otherwise silent. There is the occasional soft drip of water falling from a garment onto the floorboards, or into the basin that you have placed beneath the hanging items to catch the runoff. Each drip makes a small distinct sound that echoes slightly in the humid air, and then is absorbed into the general quiet. There is also the faint rustle of fabric moving in the drafts as the air currents shift, and the hanging garments sway slightly on their rope. This rustle is a soft whisper that comes and goes, and it is accompanied by the creak of the rope stretching under the weight, and the tiny ticks of the wooden chair adjusting to the moisture that has seeped into its joints. The garments change their shape as they dry, and the wrinkles that were pressed into them during the wringing become set into the fabric. The linen shirts develop a network of fine creases that follow the direction of the twist, and these creases will remain until the shirt is worn or until it is dampened again and smoothed by hand. The wool stockings shrink slightly as they dry, and they become stiffer and rougher to the touch than they were when they were wet. The cotton undergarments dry soft and pliable, and they retain a faint smell of the lye soap that will fade with wearing. Each piece takes on the particular character of its drying, and no two pieces dry in exactly the same way or at exactly the same rate. The drying continues through the afternoon and into the evening, and you go about your other quiet tasks while the laundry hangs around you. The room feels smaller, with the fabric taking up space, and the light is dimmer because the hanging garments block some of the light from the window. The shadows on the walls are softer and more complex because the light that does pass through the fabric is filtered and colored by the cloth. A linen shirt hanging near the window casts a pale golden shadow on the opposite wall, while a darker wool stocking casts a deeper brownish shadow. These shadows move slightly as the garments sway in the drafts, and they create a slow shifting pattern that is restful to watch. The first items to dry are the thinnest ones, the kitchen cloths on the table, which become stiff and slightly curled at the edges as the last of the moisture leaves them. You test them by pressing your palm against the cloth and feeling for any coolness that would indicate remaining dampness. When they are fully dry, they are light and crisp, and they have a clean smell that is pleasant and familiar. You fold them and stack them on the corner of the table, and they will be put away in their proper place later. The heavier items take much longer, and some of them will not be completely dry until the following morning. The wool stockings are the slowest, because wool holds moisture deep within its fibers and releases it reluctantly over many hours. You can feel the difference between a dry stocking and a damp one by the temperature, because the evaporating moisture cools the fabric slightly, and a damp stocking feels cool against your skin, while a dry one feels neutral and warm. You rotate the hanging items from time to time, moving them to new positions on the rope, so that all sides are exposed to the air equally and no part remains damp while the rest is dry. The evening comes, and you light the oil lamp, and the warm glow of the flame adds another layer to the scene of drying laundry. The lamplight passes through the hanging fabric and creates soft overlapping shadows, and the white undergarments glow with a warm golden color that makes them look almost beautiful. The smell of the burning lamp mingles with the clean smell of the laundry and the faint mustiness of the old plaster, and the whole room is filled with a complex, quiet presence that is the sum of all these things together. Before you go to sleep, you check the laundry one last time, and you find that most of it is dry enough to be taken down and folded. You remove the garments from the rope and from the chairs, and you fold them carefully, smoothing the wrinkles with your palms and stacking them in neat piles. The fabric is soft and warm from the residual heat of the stove, and it has a fresh, clean smell that is the reward for the hours of effort. You place the folded items in the small chest where you keep your clothing, and you close the lid, and the room seems suddenly larger and emptier without the hanging laundry. The rope is left bare and it sways slightly in the draught, and the chair is dry now and the table is clear of the kitchen cloths. The only evidence of the washing is the damp patch on the floorboards beneath where the laundry hung, and the faint smell of clean cotton that lingers in the air. The basin has been emptied and wiped clean, and it sits against the wall, waiting for the next washing day. The bar of soap is back in its dish, and the washboard is leaning in its corner, and the cloth bag hangs empty on the hook, waiting to be filled again. The weight of laundry has been lifted for now, and the room has returned to its usual state of quiet stillness. The water that was carried up from the pump and heated on the stove and used to wash the fabric has completed its journey, and it has been returned to the air shaft, where it will join the other water that flows through the building and eventually find its way back to the ground. The fabric that was soiled and worn is now clean and dry and ready to be worn again, and the cycle will repeat itself in another week or so when the bag on the door grows heavy once more. For now, the room is quiet and the laundry is done, and the slow rhythm of the evening continues undisturbed. The evening has settled over the building like a blanket being drawn slowly upward from the ground floor to the roof. The sounds that filled the air shaft and the hallways and the stairwells during the day have begun to diminish one by one, and the quality of the quiet that replaces them is different from the quiet of the afternoon or the quiet of the early morning. This is the quiet of the building preparing itself for the long stretch of darkness and stillness that will last until the first grey light of dawn seeps through the windows and stirs the first sleepers from their rest. You are in your small room, and you have finished the last of the evening tasks. The lamp has been turned down to its lowest setting, and it glows with a tiny flame that casts a faint warm circle on the floorboards near the bed. The stove door is closed, and the draught is set for the night, and the fire inside has settled into a deep red glow that pulses softly when the air moves through the flue. The room is warm enough and the walls have absorbed the heat of the day, and they will release it slowly through the night hours. You sit for a moment in the chair near the window, and you listen to the building as it begins its slow descent into silence. The first sound to fade is the sound of footsteps on the stairs. During the early evening there was a steady rhythm of people returning home, climbing the warm treads with the heavy steps of tired bodies and the lighter steps of those who still had energy from the day. You could hear the individual footfalls as distinct sounds, the creak of the third step, and the groan of the seventh step, and the soft thud of a foot on the landing. These sounds came at irregular intervals as different people made their way up at different times. But now the intervals have grown longer and the footsteps have become less frequent. A single set of steps echoes up the stairwell from the ground floor, and you hear the familiar pattern of creaks and groans as someone climbs slowly to the third floor, and then the sound of a door opening and closing, and then silence again. After that, there are no more footsteps and the stairs are still. The voices that drifted through the walls and up the air shaft have faded as well. During the evening you could hear the low murmur of conversations in the rooms around you. A soft background of human sound that was comforting in its presence, even though you could not make out the words. The voices rose and fell in the patterns of ordinary talk with occasional laughter or a sharper word that cut through the murmur and then subsided. Now the voices have grown softer and fewer, and they have been replaced by the smaller sounds of people preparing for sleep. You hear the creak of a bed frame as someone settles onto a mattress in the room above. You hear the soft thump of shoes being set down on a wooden floor in the room across the air shaft. You hear the faint clink of a basin being emptied into a bucket, and the gentle splash of water, and then the sound of a cloth being wrung out. These sounds are quiet and intimate, and they are the last evidence of waking life before sleep takes hold. The building itself has its own sounds that become more noticeable as the human sounds diminish. The joists and beams that hold up the floors and the roof have been under the weight of the day, and they have absorbed the movements of the people who live here. Now that the movements have stopped, the wood begins to release the tensions that have built up over the hours. You hear a series of soft ticks and creaks that come from the walls and the ceiling and the floor. These sounds are not loud and they do not startle you because you have heard them every night, and you know that they are simply the building settling into a new position for the night. A long, slow creak travels across the ceiling from the window side of the room to the door side, and it sounds like a heavy sigh released from the old pine boards. A sharp tick comes from the corner near the stove, and it is followed by a softer tick a moment later, as if the first sound had an echo that was slightly delayed. The pipes in the walls make their own contributions to the night sounds. The water that was used for washing and cooking and drinking has made its way through the pipes and down to the drains, and the last of it is still moving through the system. You hear a distant gurgle from somewhere deep in the wall behind the stove, and it rises in pitch and then fades away, leaving only the memory of the sound. A soft knocking comes from the pipe that runs up the corner of the air shaft, and it repeats 3 times in a slow rhythm and then stops. This is the sound of the metal contracting as it cools, and it is a sound that you have come to associate with the late evening hours when the building is giving up the last of its warmth to the cold night air. The sounds from the street have changed as well, and they reach your window as a much fainter version of their daytime selves. The rumble of wagons has ceased almost entirely because the work of hauling goods is done for the day, and the horses are in their stables, and the carts are parked in yards and alleys. An occasional wagon does pass by, and you hear the slow clopping of hooves and the grind of iron wheels on cobblestones, but these sounds are isolated and they do not blend into the constant background hum of the daytime street. The voices of street vendors are gone, and the calls of children playing are gone, and the only human sounds from outside are the occasional footsteps of someone walking home late, and the distant murmur of a conversation that fades as the speakers move out of earshot. The street itself is quieter but not completely silent, because there is always the low hum of the city that never stops. This hum is made up of countless small sounds that are too distant to identify individually, and they blend together into a single deep note that vibrates through the ground and the brick walls and the wooden floors. You can feel this hum more than you can hear it, and it is a constant presence that you have grown so accustomed to that you only notice it when you stop and pay attention. The hum is the sound of the city breathing, and it will continue through the night without pause or variation. In the air shaft, the sounds have become sparse and isolated. The last of the kitchen sounds faded an hour ago, and the last of the conversations faded after that. Now the shaft carries only the occasional small sound that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. A baby cries briefly in a room several floors below, and the sound travels up the shaft as a soft wail that is muffled by the brick walls and the closed windows. The cry lasts for only a moment, and then it is soothed away and the shaft falls silent again. A door closes somewhere far down, and the thud echoes up the shaft and bounces between the parallel walls, creating a series of diminishing repetitions that sound like soft footsteps walking away into the distance. A cat somewhere in the bottom of the shaft makes a small sound that is half meow and half question, and it is answered by silence. The quality of the darkness in the room has deepened as the evening has progressed. When you first sat down in the chair, there was still a faint grey light coming through the window from the sky above the air shaft. This light was barely enough to see by, but it was present, and it gave shape to the window frame and the outline of the opposite wall. Now that light is gone and the window is a rectangle of complete blackness that is indistinguishable from the wall around it. The only light in the room comes from the tiny flame of the lamp and the faint red glow from the stove door, and these small sources create a soft, warm presence that is comforting in the deep darkness. The shadows have swallowed the corners of the room and the ceiling and the far wall, and the space feels smaller and more enclosed than it does during the day. The temperature in the room has begun its slow, nightly decline. The stove is still radiating warmth, but the fire is burning low and the heat it produces is less than it was an hour ago. The walls are still warm to the touch near the stove, but they are cool near the window and near the exterior wall. The floorboards have cooled as well, and if you were to walk barefoot across the room, you would feel the difference between the boards near the stove, which are faintly warm, and the boards near the door, which are cool, and the boards near the window, which are cool, and the boards near the window, which are cold. The average sofa is still comfortable, but you can feel the chill waiting at the edges of the room, and you know that by morning it will have crept inward and the room will be cold when you wake. You rise from the chair and you move slowly about the room, making the final preparations for sleep. Your movements are quiet and deliberate, and you try not to make any sounds that might disturb the stillness that has settled over the building. The floorboards creak softly under your feet, but you know which boards are the loudest, and you step around them or place your weight carefully to minimize the sound. You check the stove one last time and you see that the coal is burning steadily, and that the draft is set correctly, and that there is no danger of the fire going out before morning. You touch the side of the stove and it is warm but not hot, and you can feel the heat radiating outward in gentle waves. You go to the window and you stand for a moment looking out into the absolute darkness of the air shaft. There is nothing to see because the night is moonless and the sky above the shaft is overcast and no light reaches down into this narrow space. The darkness is complete and it presses against the glass like a solid thing, and your own reflection is barely visible as a faint ghost that looks back at you with empty eyes. You can hear the distant sound of the city hum and the closer sound of your own breathing and nothing else. The air shaft is a deep well of silence and darkness, and it will remain so until the first grey light of morning finds its way down from the sky above. You turn away from the window and you move toward the bed. The bed is a simple wooden frame with a mattress filled with straw or cotton batting, and it has been in this room for many years. The frame creaks softly when you sit on the edge, and the ropes beneath the mattress stretch slightly under your weight. You remove your outer clothing and you fold it and place it on the chair near the bed where it will be easy to reach in the morning. The air feels cool on your skin, and you are aware of the slight draft that moves through the room from the gap under the door to the gap around the window frame. You lie down and you pull the blankets up around your shoulders, and you feel the warmth of your own body beginning to heat the small space beneath the covers. The room is quiet now, and the building is quiet, and the city outside is as quiet as it ever gets. You lie in the darkness and you listen to the small sounds that remain. The lamp makes a soft hissing sound as the tiny flame consumes the last of the oil in the wick. The stove ticks once and then twice as the metal cools and contracts. A floorboard creaks somewhere in the room above, and it is followed by a soft padding sound that might be bare feet walking to the window and then back to the bed. A distant dog barks somewhere far away in the city, and the sound is so faint that you might have imagined it. The hum of the city continues without change, and it is the last sound that you are aware of as you drift towards sleep. The building has entered its deepest rest, and the walls and the floors and the ceilings are still. The people who live here are sleeping, and their breathing is slow and regular, and their dreams are private and unknowable. The rooms are dark and the furniture stands in silent rows, and the only movement is the slow drift of dust motes settling onto surfaces and the imperceptible shift of shadows as the night progresses. The stairwells are empty and the hallways are empty, and the only light comes from the faint glow of the street lamps that filters through the front windows and casts long pale rectangles on the hallway floors. In the courtyard, the pump stands silent and cold, and the flagstones are damp with the night dew. The ash pile against the back wall has cooled completely, and it sits in a soft grey mound that will be added to in the morning. The wooden fence at the back of the yard creaks softly in the breeze that moves through the narrow spaces between the buildings. A cat moves silently across the flagstones and disappears into a gap beneath the cellar door, and then the yard is still again. On the street outside, the gas lamps burn with their steady yellow glow, and they cast pools of light on the cobblestones that are interrupted by long stretches of darkness between them. A night watchman walks slowly down the sidewalk and his lantern swings from his hand, and the light moves in a slow arc that illuminates first the wall, and then the curb, and then the street, and then the wall again. His footsteps are slow and measured, and they make a soft scraping sound on the stone slabs. He passes beneath the window at the end of the hallway, and his lantern light reaches up and touches the glass for a moment, and then he moves on, and the light fades, and the window is dark again. The hours pass without event, and the building remains in its state of deep quiet. The fire in the stove burns lower, and the coals shift slightly as they are consumed, and a small puff of ash falls through the grate into the pan below. The lamp flame wavers once as a draught finds its way through a crack, and then it steadies again. The walls cool by a fraction of a degree, and the wood contracts by a tiny amount, and a single soft creak travels down the length of a joist, and then stops. The night deepens, and the darkness becomes absolute, and the silence becomes so complete that you can hear the sound of your own heartbeat if you lie very still and listen. In the deepest part of the night, there is a moment when the city itself seems to hold its breath. The distant hum that is always present fades slightly, and the individual sounds that make it up become so faint that they disappear altogether. The buildings stand in their rows, and the streets are empty, and the sky above is a deep blue-black that shows no stars. In this moment, the tenement is a solid block of brick and wood and plaster that contains within its walls the sleeping forms of all the people who live here. The building holds them in the darkness and the silence, and it asks nothing of them, and it gives nothing back except the simple shelter of its rooms. Then the moment passes, and the city hum returns, and the faint sounds of the night resume. A distant wagon rumbles somewhere far away, and the sound travels through the ground and into the foundation stones and up through the walls. A baby stirs in a room on the second floor and makes a small sound, and then settles back into sleep. The wind shifts above the rooftops, and a new draft moves through the air shaft and rattles a loose window sash somewhere below. These sounds are so faint that they do not disturb the sleepers, and they blend into the background of the night like threads woven into a dark fabric. The night continues its slow progress toward morning, and the building waits in the darkness. The first sign of the coming day will be a subtle change in the quality of the blackness outside the window. A faint grayness that is not yet light, but only the absence of complete dark. This change will come slowly, and it will be imperceptible at first, and then gradually it will grow until the outlines of the window frame become visible against the sky. The sounds of the building will begin to change as well, and the first stirrings of the waking residents will echo up the air shaft and down the hallways. The stove will be opened, and fresh coal will be added, and the fire will roar back to life. The pump handle in the courtyard will creak as the first bucket of water is drawn. The routine will begin again, but that is still hours away, and for now the building rests in the deep quiet of the night. The walls are still, and the floors are still, and the ceiling is still. The people sleep, and the rooms are dark, and the only sound is the soft hiss of the lamp and the distant hum of the city and the occasional creak of wood settling into a new position. The tenement holds its breath and waits for the morning, and the quiet is complete and unbroken, and it stretches on into the darkness without end.